Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We will now start with story 1. The Royal Seal, document authentication in the Arpad dynasty. You are standing in the dim stone hallway of a 12th century Hungarian castle, where the air is thick with dust and the scent of old beeswax. On a heavy wooden table, parchment scrolls lie unfurled beside a curious object, the royal seal. As dull as it may seem today, this small, stamped image once held the power to command armies, divide lands, appoint bishops, and settle centuries-long disputes. In this section, we will explore how the seemingly boring business of document authentication was a central pillar in the architecture of early Hungarian governance under the Arpad dynasty. It was not war, not bloodline, but bureaucratic approval, the careful pressing of a seal into warm wax that could make or break the lives of nobles and peasants alike. The origin of royal seals in Hungary. The tradition of using seals in Hungary traces its roots back to the early Christianization of the kingdom in the year 1000, when Istvan, Stephen I, was crowned with a crown sent from Rome. This religious endorsement formalized the kingdom's bureaucratic relationship with Western Europe. Seals, a Roman tradition already used in the papal chancery, were a natural extension of this. Initially, documents were authenticated solely through witness signatures and public readings. But as written records became more common, the need for a consistent and trustworthy form of validation grew. The seal entered the scene not as a symbol of royal flair, but as a necessary tool of monotony, a way to standardize authority in a growing paper-based administration. By the 12th century, nearly all royal documents in Hungary were authenticated with a wax seal pressed with a matrix bearing the monarch's image and titles. And so, the seal quietly became a source of legitimate power. How a document became real. To modern ears, the process of writing a letter or decree sounds simple. Compose the content, sign your name, and perhaps email it off. But in the 12th century, things moved slower and more ceremoniously. First, the notarius, a royal scribe, would draft the text, usually in Latin, using a style appropriate to the office from which it was issued. There was a specific formula to follow: invocation, protocol, notification, disposition, corroboration, and date. Deviating from this order risked the document being dismissed as invalid. Then it passed to the cancellarius, who checked the wording and ensured its compatibility with past rulings and privileges. The office of the chancellor was both boring and terrifying. One mistake could lead to land being granted twice, or noble rights revoked unlawfully. Once approved, a strip of parchment called the tag was cut and passed through a slit at the base of the document. Heated beeswax, often colored red for the monarch or green for ecclesiastical use, was poured onto the tag's end. The royal matrix, sometimes attached to the monarch's personal signet ring or held in the chancery, was then pressed into the wax, leaving a unique imprint. Only now did the document exist in a legal sense. Types of seals. Over time, Hungary developed a rich taxonomy of seals. Royal Great Seal, Sigillum Majus, used for major edicts such as land grants or noble titles. These were often large and intricate. Royal Secret Seal, Sigillum Secretum, used for sensitive or personal communication. Smaller, simpler. Archbishop's Seal, for ecclesiastical matters. These often carried religious imagery rather than monarchical motifs. Noble seals authorized nobles to confirm agreements without royal oversight. These became increasingly common by the 13th century. Each seal had to be guarded carefully. A lost or stolen seal matrix was a political emergency. It meant forgeries could be made. In fact, the destruction of an outgoing monarch's seal was a formal ceremony. It marked the end of a reign not just symbolically, but administratively. Forgeries, tampering, and bureaucratic paranoia. As seal usage spread, so too did the problem of forgery. Monasteries and nobles alike occasionally discovered centuries-old documents that by sheer coincidence granted them expanded privileges or confirmed disputed lands. To combat this, the royal chancery began keeping registries of issued documents. These were copied and stored, often by hand, into thick codices. Comparing a presented document against the registry could take weeks, but it became necessary. Clerks would sometimes measure the exact diameter and depth of a seal impression. Any deviation might be grounds for suspicion. Wax composition, string braiding, parchment texture all became points of analysis. It was not exciting work, but it was essential. The Hungarian Diet Parliament, even centuries later, would spend entire sessions debating whether a seal had been applied during the appropriate monarch's reign, sometimes overturning long-held assumptions based on a discoloration in wax. The Chancery as a monastic order. During the reign of King Bela III, 1172–1196, the royal chancery became more formalized, staffed by trained clerics rather than random nobles. These men lived almost like monks, devoting their lives to documents, drafts, copies, and sealings. They worked in near silence, illuminated by candlelight, under strict regulations. Mistakes were not corrected with an eraser or a new draft, but by starting from scratch. One misspelled name in a land grant could lead to generations of lawsuits. For the bored but meticulous mind, this was sacred work. A slow pulse in a fast world. To the modern eye, this world of seals and silent clerks seems laughably slow. But in a society where time was measured by the seasons, not the hour, this slowness was its own form of power. The delay of a seal could delay a war. The lack of a seal could undo a marriage, and the forgery of a seal could rewrite history. What remains fascinating is how central this entire system was to the function of medieval Hungary. Without these dull wax impressions, society would have unraveled. The seal in its silence spoke louder than the sword. The Chancery, Hungary's most boring but powerful room. Now you're seated imaginatively, of course in the cool interior of a 13th century Hungarian chancery. The walls are lined with parchment rolls, beeswax blocks, and bundles of goose quills in jars of ink thickened with soot. A clerk coughs quietly in the corner as he traces a line of text with his finger, double-checking the Latin grammar. Nearby, another man is slowly melting wax, stirring it like a chef, waiting for the right consistency. The royal seal you learned about in Section 1 wasn't merely an object, it was the endpoint of an entire machine, the Chancery. This administrative organ, little discussed in most popular historical accounts, was perhaps the most stable and powerful force in the medieval kingdom of Hungary. Not kings, not bishops, but clerks. In this section, we dig into the men behind the documents, who they were, how they worked, and why the dullest roles held the keys to royal authority. Who were these clerks? By the 12th and 13th centuries, Hungarian kings increasingly relied on educated clerics to run their chancery. These men were often trained at cathedral schools or in Benedictine monasteries. Their qualifications: literacy above all, Latin fluency, good penmanship, steadiness of hand, and the ability to endure hour after hour of repetitive tasks. They were not nobles, at least not in the beginning. In fact, many of them came from middle or even peasant backgrounds. Their path to influence came not through birth or battlefield glory, but by their ability to write, copy, and notarize documents without errors. Because of this, the Chancery offered a peculiar kind of social mobility in a rigid society. A clever peasant boy, if taken in by a monastery and trained well, could become a royal notary and wield power over lords 10 times his status on parchment, if not in person. But the job had its costs. Chancery workers were often celibate, poorly paid, and overworked. Some lived in the Chancery itself. Their daily lives were a monotonous loop of drafting, sealing, archiving and recopying fatting scrolls. One chronicler wrote that a good clerk should move only his fingers, never his mouth. The rhythm of paperwork. You might imagine the chancery as a chaotic place, scrolls flying, people shouting. But it was quite the opposite. The rhythm of the Hungarian chancery was more like a monastery than a market. Each document followed a precise formula, and the workflow resembled liturgy. Here, what the life cycle of a document looked like. Petition. A noble or town sent a request to the court, often by messenger on horseback. Reception. A low-ranking clerk opened and recorded the request in a register. Drafting. A more senior notary translated the request into Latin, fitted to chancery structure. Review. The draft passed to the chancellor or his deputy, who edited for language and legality. Confirmation. If approved, a clean final copy was produced, sometimes in duplicate. Sealing. The appropriate wax color and seal matrix were selected. The document was authenticated. Recording. A copy of the document's content and date was made into the Chancery Registry. Dispatch. A courier delivered the final sealed document, sometimes by horseback, sometimes by boat on the Danube. The process could take days or weeks, depending on the document's urgency. Some nobles waited months, but they waited because without that seal, even a king's spoken promise was worthless in court. Wax colors and cord braiding, a bureaucratic language. Beyond the written Latin text, Hungarian royal documents spoke a separate language through wax color, cord type, and attachment method. Red wax, used by the monarch or archbishops, signified royal or ecclesiastical authority. Green wax, used for long-term grants, often land, symbolized permanence and fertility. Brown or natural wax, used for temporary matters, including leases and temporary orders. Cord color and weave. The cords attaching the wax to the document had their own code. Braiding style could indicate office rank. Blue and white cords were reserved for judicial rulings. Even the size of the seal impression carried meaning. Larger seals suggested greater significance. In fact, some petitioners requested larger seals to impress rivals. In an age where few could read, these visual cues acted like metadata, silent indicators of content, legitimacy, and origin. When the chancery failed. Of course, no system is perfect. The chancery had its failures, some accidental, some political. The forged charter of 1220. One of the most infamous cases involved a forged land charter supposedly issued by King Andrew II. The document, found centuries later, bore a seal in red wax, but the seal's design matched a version not used until the 1240s. The cords were also woven incorrectly, and the Latin grammar showed signs of a foreign scribe. The forgery was eventually discovered during a 15th century dispute, but the land had already passed through 4 generations. The case raised an uncomfortable truth. The Chancery's language, so carefully constructed to appear invincible, was still vulnerable to human error and manipulation. The seal theft crisis of 1291. In another episode, the royal secret seal was reportedly stolen by a rogue clerk and used to authorize dozens of false decrees. The event triggered a complete freeze of all chancery functions for 3 weeks. Royal messengers were dispatched across the kingdom to inform officials to ignore any documents dated during that period. The false documents were collected and burned in a public ceremony. From then on, the Chancellery began a practice of rotating seal matrices every decade and stamping serial numbers on certain high-level documents, a practice well ahead of its time. Decentralized bureaucracy, county chanceries. By the late Arpad era, the central royal chancery was no longer enough. As the kingdom grew in complexity, counties began developing their own miniature chanceries. These local offices handled issues like land border disputes between peasants or minor nobles, regional tax exemptions, local inheritance confirmations, duplications of royal documents for safekeeping. County notaries were often less educated than their royal counterparts and more susceptible to local pressure. Bribery was not uncommon, yet they provided vital redundancy. When the royal chancery was overwhelmed or unreachable during war or plague, county chanceries kept the machinery of the state grinding forward. Ironically, this decentralization made the whole system both more inefficient and more resilient. The clerical personality. If you had walked into the chancery around the year 1245, you would have met men with ink-stained fingers, stooped backs, and eyes worn from candlelight. They were quiet, methodical, obsessive. They corrected each other's Latin declensions in whispers. They were not warriors, nor priests, nor kings, but the authority of all three passed through their fingers. These clerks recorded coronations, annulled marriages, punished treason, and registered saints. Their names are mostly lost. A few, like Magister Felicianus, active under Bela IV, are known because they signed royal letters and drafts. But for the most part, the men who built Hungary's bureaucracy lived and died in obscurity, underpaid, overburdened, and irreplaceable. What drove them? Perhaps it was the power of shaping law through language. Perhaps it was simply the rare opportunity to serve in a meaningful way without noble birth. Or perhaps it was simply the peace of routine, the quiet ticking of order in a chaotic world. Ephemeral power, permanent ink. In a strange twist of history, many of these sealed documents outlived the monarchs who signed them. A letter confirming tax exemption for a monastery in Esztergom might survive for 400 years in a church archive even as kings fell, wars raged, and cities burned. When you run your finger across one of these scrolls in a museum today, you're not just touching ink and wax. You're touching the long afterlife of a system that depended on careful hands, silent rooms, and the relentless recording of the mundane. The seal may have been the climax, but the real story lies in the rooms behind it. A kingdom without a king. As the Arpad dynasty neared its end in 1301 with the death of Andrew III, Hungary faced a unique crisis, not of war or plague, but of paperwork. You see, Andrew had no male heir, and thus the crown, the literal and symbolic object of divine right, lacked a clear successor. Yet while the throne sat vacant and claimants argued, one part of the kingdom never truly stopped functioning: the chancery. Even in the vacuum of power, clerks continued sealing documents. County chanceries still authenticated peasant complaints. Monasteries maintained their records. In a strange way, bureaucracy outlasted monarchy. This final section of Story 1 traces the long shadow of the Arpad era seal not just in wax, but in culture, law, and the very idea of governance in Hungary and beyond. We will explore how the rhythms of this boring system carved deep grooves into the functioning of a kingdom that had to learn how to persist through dynastic rupture. The seal as continuity. After the fall of the Arpads, Hungary experienced a series of competing royal claims from Charles of Anjou to Wenceslas of Bohemia. But none of them could govern without first establishing legitimacy through documents and seals. In fact, many early decrees issued by Charles I, 1300–1342, reference seals, not military victories, as evidence of lawful rule. He went so far as to have his predecessor's seals ceremonially destroyed in public, just as the Arpads had done for centuries. This act, while dull in appearance, was critical. It signified the official end of one era and the bureaucratic beginning of another. Charles also reinforced the importance of archival continuity. Rather than purging the chancery of old staff, he retained many of Andrew III's notaries, understanding that their knowledge of the paper trail was more valuable than any army. To the people of Hungary, it wasn't just who sat on the throne that mattered. It was whether their land grants, titles, tax exemptions, and legal rights still held on parchment, in registry under seal. Bureaucracy as a weapon. What's perhaps most fascinating and most quietly terrifying is how the bureaucracy that had once served to authenticate justice could be turned into a tool of domination. Charles I and his successors began to use the chancery as a way to reorganize society. Nobles who opposed him sometimes found their ancient privileges unregistered or invalid, their seals questioned, their legal protections weakened. In contrast, loyal supporters were granted new documents, written in flawless chancery Latin, carrying the unmistakable mark of the new king's wax. The seal, once a neutral tool, now carried political weight. Bureaucratic style was no longer just about formatting. It became an extension of authority and ideology. One noble family, the Abba clan, famously fell out of favor and discovered conveniently that their documents had suffered decay and damage, requiring reissuance. Many of their holdings were reassigned through new royal charters, neatly sealed and dated under Charles's newly minted matrix. Order, it seems, can be just as dangerous as chaos. The rise of the judicial chancery. As Hungary developed, so too did its administrative organs. In the late 14th century, a separate judicial chancery was formed focused not on royal edicts, but on interpreting and applying the law. This new body produced volumes of case decisions, legal opinions, and rulings, all bearing distinct seals. The seal here acted like a judicial signature, confirming that a given interpretation carried state authority. Many of these rulings dealt with seemingly dull matters. Who owned a patch of woods between two villages? Whether a widow's claim on her husband's estate was valid under custom. If a charter issued in 1237 still applied in 1381. Each case required review of seals, registries, and document formatting. Entire disputes hinged on whether a clerk had used the wrong verb tense or attached a seal using a flat press instead of a chain pendant. This obsession with detail, however mind-numbing, built Hungary's reputation as one of the most legally complex and bureaucratically rich kingdoms in medieval Europe. The clerical legacy, language and literacy. One overlooked legacy of the seal era is linguistic. Because Latin was the language of chancery communication, generations of Hungarian administrators, clergy, and even some nobles grew up reading, writing, and thinking in Latin. This had two important effects. Stability. Even when kings changed or invasions occurred, Latin-based communication ensured continuity. Isolation. As vernacular Hungarian evolved, it remained absent from formal governance. For centuries, official documents excluded the language spoken by the majority. Thus, a peculiar divide emerged. Most Hungarians lived in a world of oral tradition and peasant contracts, while their rulers and judges operated in a paper world of Latin formulae and wax authority. In a way, the seal reinforced a cognitive elite, a small group who could read, interpret, and manipulate the legal structure of the realm. These individuals were not always the richest or most powerful, but they knew where the land records were stored, and they knew who held the key to the registry chest. Wax in the age of gunpowder. As Europe moved into the early modern period, the use of seals began to shift. Printed signatures, paper stamps, and serial numbers entered government offices, but Hungary remained loyal to its seal culture well into the 17th century. In 1556, for instance, a letter from a regional judge in Kassa still used a pendant wax seal, with the cord dyed blue and yellow to signify a joint ruling between secular and religious authorities. Even as gunpowder changed warfare, and the printing press revolutionized literacy, the slow, careful choreography of wax, matrix, and parchment remained. It wasn't stubbornness. It was legal infrastructure. Court cases still relied on seal authentication. Tax records were stored in bound, sealed volumes. Church properties referenced charters written in the 1200s, still valid under the law so long as their seals hadn't been broken. And in some towns, breaking a seal was still a crime punishable by imprisonment. The seal as national memory. Centuries later, Hungarian nationalists in the 19th century would look back at the Chancery era with mixed feelings. On the one hand, they saw it as a symbol of foreign domination of Latin over Hungarian, of clerics over farmers. But on the other, they recognized that the stability it provided had helped the kingdom survive Mongol invasions, dynastic wars, and Ottoman pressure. The archives, many filled with sealed parchments, became sites of historical inquiry. Researchers began compiling registries of royal charters, mapping land transitions, and analyzing chancery language to understand not just legal history, but social transformation. In 1885, the Hungarian Academy of Sciences launched a project to catalog every Arpad-era sealed document still in existence. It was slow, excruciating work, but it brought to light the endurance of bureaucratic memory. A seal pressed into wax in 1173 could still influence debate in a modern parliament. What other object so simple, so silent could do that? Lessons from the wax trail. So what do we take from this long and seemingly uneventful story of seals and scrolls? First, that history is not made only on the battlefield or the throne. It is shaped, often irrevocably, by the quiet work of anonymous people doing repetitive, structured labor recording, sealing, preserving. Second, that power can reside in systems, not just symbols. A king's crown may glitter, but without the bureaucracy behind it, it is only decoration. The real power often lies with those who decide how a promise is recorded and when it is recognized. Third, that stability, while boring, is not to be mocked. The royal seal did not win wars or forge alliances, but it enabled a kingdom to know itself, to remember who owned what, who promised what, and who had the right to speak. And finally, that even in a digital age, the instincts that built Hungary's chancery still exist. We seek verification. We fear forgery. We trust official formatting. And we hope that someone somewhere is quietly keeping track of it all. Final reflection: the seal and the human need for order. Perhaps the seal's greatest legacy is psychological. It offered something precious in a world of uncertainty: legitimacy. It told peasants that their rights were recorded. It told nobles that their lineages were acknowledged. It told cities that their privileges were remembered. In every era, humans crave the same thing: that their actions matter, that their words endure, that their agreements outlive the moment. In medieval Hungary, the seal was how that desire was met. So next time you sign a contract, receive an official letter, or even click "I agree" on a digital form, remember the wax, the press, and the clerk who spent an hour warming it just right. They weren't exciting, but they were essential. Story 2, Section 1. The Office of the Palatine, Mediating Power and Petty Disputes. The shadow beside the throne. You find yourself in a medieval Hungarian hall, not the royal throne room, but the chamber just beside it. There's no crown here, no regalia, no ceremonial sword. Only a scroll, a ledger, and a quietly observant man with a broad seal ring on his finger. He is not the king, but to most of the kingdom his word carries nearly equal weight. He is the Nadorospan, or Palatine, the king's chief deputy, chief justice, and the most powerful secular official in medieval Hungary after the monarch himself. In this section, we explore how this seemingly obscure position became the backbone of political mediation, the go-between in aristocratic disputes, and the administrator who kept the noble class from eating itself alive. While kings ruled by divine right and led armies, it was often the Palatine who listened to grievances, settled disputes, and quite literally kept the peace. He was neither a priest nor a warrior, but a bureaucrat of the highest order, balancing loyalty to the king with the expectations of the increasingly self-confident nobility. This first section introduces the evolution and early functions of the Palatine, from the shadowy beginnings of the Arpad period to his formalization as a key institutional pillar by the 13th century. Origins of the Palatinal office. The title Palatine from the Latin comes Palatinus has Roman roots, referring to a count of the palace. The term first appeared in Hungarian sources in the 11th century, under King Stephen I, though the role's real authority grew slowly. In the early days, the Palatine was the king's domestic manager, overseeing court life and property. But as Hungary expanded territorially, so too did the complexities of governance. Royal attention was often consumed by wars, foreign diplomacy, or ecclesiastical matters. Someone was needed to manage the increasingly fractious nobility and ensure that barons didn't settle land disputes with swords. By the reign of Ladislaus I, 1077-1095, the Palatine had begun acting as a general administrator sent to handle regional complaints, levy troops, and adjudicate legal appeals in the king's absence. Yet the Palatine was not, strictly speaking, a viceroy. He had no kingdom of his own, no court of grandeur. His power came from paper, precedent, and proximity to the king. Authority by absence. The strength of the Palatine lay in the paradox of absence. The king could not be everywhere, he could not hear every grievance, settle every land dispute, or mediate every inheritance quarrel. The Palatine filled that vacuum. By the mid-12th century, the Palatine was regularly delegated judicial powers. In practice, he became arbiter of noble disputes, guardian of orphaned or minor nobles, overseer of county administration, protector of non-nobles in cases of abuse by local lords. But most critically, he became the voice of the king when the king was away. He did not replace the monarch. Rather, he represented the monarch in specific, often mundane matters that nonetheless shaped the lives of thousands. He was, in a sense, a very high-level bureaucratic mediator, one whose greatest strength was patience. The Palatine's court, an exercise in tedious power. The Palatine's authority manifested most frequently through his mobile court. Unlike the king's traveling court accompanied by fanfare and banners, the Palatine's court traveled quietly, like a caravan of clerks and notaries. Nobles from the surrounding counties would bring their complaints, and cases would be heard in a structured order. Proof of right. The claimant produced a sealed charter proving land ownership or privilege. Witness deposition. Statements from clergy, noble neighbors, or local notaries. Seal review. Verification of authenticity wax, cords, and signatures. Legal reasoning. The Palatine or his deputy would cite custom, prior charters, or kingly orders. Verdict, delivered in Latin, sealed and recorded in registry. A case might involve a dispute over a crumbling watchtower, or whether a stream had shifted far enough to affect a boundary. Rarely were such matters life and death, but they were persistent, and they could spiral into violence if left unresolved. The Palatine's genius was his ability to resolve these disputes without force. He offered not power but order. Between king and barons. By the 13th century, as Hungary's nobility grew more assertive and the king's direct control waned in certain regions, the Palatine's role became more delicate. He was expected to maintain loyalty to the crown while protecting the rights of nobles from royal overreach. This balancing act is best seen during the reign of Andrew II, 1205–1235, a king infamous for lavish land grants and fiscal mismanagement. Discontented nobles turned to the Palatine at the time, a man named Denis, son of Ampud, as a mediator. Denis found himself arbitrating not just property disputes, but policy disagreements. At one point, he personally intervened to prevent the expropriation of a monastery's lands by royal decree, arguing that the crown's previous charters, sealed and witnessed, held legal authority. His actions set a subtle precedent. The Palatine was not merely a servant of the king, but a steward of continuity. This culminated in 1222 with the issuance of the Golden Bull, Hungary's equivalent of the Magna Carta. It explicitly recognized the Palatine as the judge of the realm, the intermediary through which the nobility and monarchy would negotiate. The case of the misplaced mill, 1234. To understand how tedious and essential the Palatine's work could be, consider one real case recorded in the Palatinal Registry of 1234. A noble family in Bihar County accused a neighboring family of moving a water mill's wheel upstream, thus diverting flow and reducing the effectiveness of their own mill. The defendants claimed natural river shifts caused the change. The Palatine's court investigated for 12 weeks. They consulted monks familiar with the area, reviewed two royal charters, one from 1198, the other from 1215, and compared land surveys written in Latin. The verdict: the defendant had, in fact, shifted the wheel deliberately. He was ordered to restore the flow, pay compensation in silver florins, and receive 3 public lashings. The case was boring, but it prevented a blood feud. The Palatine's archive. Every decision made by the Palatine was recorded and stored, often in duplicate, in the Palatinal archives, usually kept in monasteries. These documents serve as a rare glimpse into the machinery of compromise. They show time and again the same formula: complaint, document, seal, testimony, verdict, over and over. And yet, these scrolls are a testament to an extraordinary reality: a medieval kingdom trying to solve its problems not with swords, but with sentences. The Palatine made that possible. He was the master of the small decision, the guardian of what historian István Bana once called Hungary's culture of procedural survival. A mediator in the age of tension. As Hungary moved deeper into the 13th and 14th centuries, the political air grew thicker with competition. Kings leaned on alliances with foreign powers, while magnates amassed private armies and ruled their lands with near-sovereign authority. Yet amid this mounting tension, the office of the Palatine held its curious place, at once subordinate to the king and indispensable to the noble class. This section explores how the Palatine evolved into a balancing force within the kingdom's political chessboard. No longer just a royal representative or conflict arbitrator, the Palatine had become a central figure in Hungary's constitutional development. Through dry proceedings, clerical mediations, and formulaic judgments, the office safeguarded not only legal order but the kingdom itself. The Golden Bull of 1222 and its legacy. The 1222 Golden Bull, signed by King Andrew II under pressure from the nobility, was more than a royal concession. It was a bureaucratic turning point. Its most overlooked feature was the formalization of the Palatine's authority. He was to act as the highest judge of the realm after the king. No noble could be imprisoned without his sentence or royal order. He was to be elected with the counsel and consent of the nobility. This last clause was crucial. It was one of the earliest examples of shared political decision-making in Hungarian governance. The Palatine was no longer merely a tool of royal, he was now expected to serve as a kind of institutional pivot between sovereign and subjects. As such, his courtroom, mundane though it appeared, became a site of constitutional performance, where power was translated into process. Rise of the noble oligarchs. In the early 14th century, following the extinction of the Arpad dynasty, Hungary entered a prolonged period of instability. Multiple foreign claimants vied for the throne, and magnates like Matthew Csack in the north and Ladislaus Khan in Transylvania acted as regional kings in all but name. In such chaos, where did the Palatine stand? Surprisingly, the position endured. Even as royal authority fractured, the Palatine continued to issue rulings, organize county assemblies, and mediate local conflicts. This wasn't because of military strength or charisma. It was because the position was embedded in legal expectation. The nobility, both minor and great, needed a mechanism to resolve grievances without going to war, and they trusted the office of the Palatine, if not always the individual holding it. It was around this time that a new function was added to the Palatine's role, presiding over the national assemblies or diets. While kings called these gatherings, the Palatine often ran them, ensuring procedural order and guiding discussions. From that point on, the Palatine became a constitutional figure, not just a judge or mediator, but a speaker, moderator, and sometimes political referee. The Palatine and the Diet. The Hungarian Diet, composed of nobles, prelates, and later townspeople, met irregularly, but was vital to national governance. Topics ranged from taxation to military service obligations, to noble rights and foreign policy. The Palatine's role here was subtle but powerful. He maintained order in debate, formally introduced royal proposals, collected and transmitted grievances, oversaw votes or consensus building. Though he could not make laws on his own, his ability to shape the conversation gave him influence far beyond his original judicial role. Often he acted as a pressure valve between the nobility and the king, a well-timed concession, issued from the Palatine's mouth rather than the monarch's, could de-escalate political crises. This role became essential during the reign of King Louis I 1342-1382, whose reforms often met resistance. Palatine Nicholas Comte, a shrewd and quiet nobleman, managed to negotiate compromises during the 1351 Diet that preserved noble tax exemptions while advancing the king's military funding goals. In the background of every big decision, there was the Palatine writing drafts, smoothing rhetoric, and arranging handshakes. A case study, the Widow's Appeal 1354. One fascinating case found in the Palatine's judicial records involves a widow named Catalin, whose late husband had left land to her in his will only for the deceased man's cousin to seize it, claiming a higher right of kinship. The cousin had the backing of the County Espon governor and a local garrison. Catalin, unusual for her time, appealed directly to the Palatine's court, arguing that a royal charter granted her husband full rights to dispose of his land. The document had a faded seal but was intact. The Palatine ruled in her favor, citing both the authority of the charter and the precedent of widow inheritance cases from the reign of Bela IV. He ordered the County Espon to restore the property and fine the cousin. This dry legal case rippled through the noble class, as it affirmed that palatinal rulings held teeth, even against local power. What's more, the Palatine did not reverse the king's charter, he defended it. The message was clear: the law, not the sword, would decide. The Palatine as a political rival. Despite being appointed by the king, often with noble approval, the Palatine could become a thorn in the monarch's side, especially when serving under unpopular or authoritarian kings. In the 15th century, as Hungary confronted growing Ottoman threats and internal noble conflict, the Palatine's institutional authority was wielded as a kind of noble counterweight to centralized monarchy. Palatines began delaying royal tax orders by citing unclear documentation, refusing to enforce unpopular laws, protecting minor nobles from royal land seizure. One particularly defiant Palatine, Emeric Perigny, openly challenged King W. Ladislaw III's appointments, refusing to confirm land transfers that lacked proper seals or charters. This was not rebellion, it was bureaucratic inertia as resistance. The king might demand action, but if the Palatine's registry didn't approve, the machinery of enforcement slowed to a crawl. It was the age-old trick of all seasoned bureaucrats: compliance through delay. The weight of procedure. What's often overlooked is just how much of the Palatine's power lay in procedure. Kings could issue decrees, but those decrees had to be drafted using proper Latin formulations, copied into regional registries, announced publicly at county assemblies, enforced by local officials, often under the Palatine's coordination. If any step faltered, the entire chain collapsed. This gave the Palatine remarkable influence. He didn't need to oppose royal policies directly. He only had to question the process. Was the charter sealed correctly? Were witnesses sufficient? Had the Diet been properly consulted? Was the tax being levied in accordance with prior exemptions? Each question might take weeks or months to resolve, and in that time conflicts cooled, deals were struck, compromises emerged. In this way, the Palatine became not just a mediator of disputes but a manager of tempo. He regulated the speed of government, not through law but through paperwork. The decline of autonomy. Eventually, like many medieval institutions, the Palatine's independence waned. As Habsburg rule took root in Hungary in the 16th century, the position was co-opted into imperial administration. Palatines were still appointed, but often from dynastic allies or loyalist families. They still ruled in law, but their judicial and constitutional powers were increasingly symbolic. And yet, the image of the Palatine as the impartial arbiter, rooted in centuries of dusty scrolls and sealed verdicts, remained powerful. In 1608, a major reform re-established the Palatine as a constitutional figurehead in a dual monarchy. Though now largely ceremonial, the position retained one ancient responsibility: presiding over Diet sessions and mediating between king and estates. Old powers, preserved like wax in a cabinet. The long fade into ceremony. By the late 17th century, as Europe lurched into a new age of absolutism, empire, and bureaucratic centralization, many medieval institutions had faded into irrelevance. The idea of a kingdom mediated through scrolls and solemn oaths was giving way to standing armies, fiscal ministries, and royal absolutism. And yet the Hungarian Palatine remained transformed, yes, but not erased. This final section of Story 2 follows the last centuries of the office of the Palatine, tracing its ceremonial persistence, symbolic power, and eventual dissolution in the early 20th century. It is the story of a post held by men whose chief authority lay not in command, but in continuity. A crown without teeth. After the 1526 Battle of Mohacs, Hungary was cleaved into three parts: the Ottoman-occupied central region, Habsburg-controlled Royal Hungary in the west, and the semi-independent Principality of Transylvania. This division created an administrative labyrinth but also ensured that traditional offices, like the Palatine, took on new importance. In Royal Hungary under Habsburg rule, the Palatine became the chief intermediary between the Habsburg monarchs and the Hungarian estates. He was still elected by the Diet technically and still presided over parliamentary sessions, but his role had shifted permanently. From judge to liaison, from arbitrator to advocate, from policy influencer to political buffer. The Palatine no longer made rulings in his own court. He no longer traveled the countryside listening to inheritance claims or field disputes. Instead, he negotiated tax demands from Vienna, calmed noble anger over foreign garrisons, and most significantly, served as a symbolic reminder that Hungarian self-governance, while limited, had not disappeared. The ceremonial weight of office. Despite his declining administrative power, the Palatine still played key roles in important ceremonies. Crowning of Hungarian kings. The Palatine assisted in presenting the Holy Crown of St. Stephen. Opening sessions of the Diet. He read the monarch's address, often balancing imperial directives with local sensitivities. Noble oaths and appointments. Nobility still swore fealty in the Palatine's presence, even when real power lay elsewhere. These acts may seem like hollow ritual, but they carried emotional and political resonance. In an age of imperial centralization, the Palatine stood as a visible link to a past where Hungary had spoken in its own voice, settled its own matters, and judged its own nobles. In a deeply bureaucratic twist, even as actual governance passed elsewhere, the memory of governance remained potent. Palatine Joseph, the last great Palatine. No history of the Palatinate is complete without mention of Archduke Joseph, József Nador, appointed Palatine in 1796. A Habsburg prince, he defied expectations by embracing his role with genuine dedication to Hungary's development and autonomy. He learned the Hungarian language, rare for a Habsburg at the time. He supported educational and agricultural reforms. He mediated between Hungarian reformers and the imperial court. He backed infrastructure projects, including the expansion of Pest. Joseph became beloved not because he wielded sweeping legal powers, but because he resurrected the original spirit of the Palatine: practical, local, and quietly influential. For decades, his presence stabilized a kingdom that teetered between reformist nationalism and imperial rigidity. He died in 1847, just before the 1848 revolution, one of the few figures who had the respect of both court and countryside. The 1848 revolution and the end of authority. The Hungarian Revolution of 1848–1849 sought greater autonomy within the Habsburg monarchy. In this context, the office of the Palatine became a political tool and then a casualty. At the revolution's height, the Diet appointed Archduke Stephen, Joseph's son, as Palatine, but he fled when violence erupted, unwilling to be a figurehead during a civil war. The role lapsed. After the revolution's defeat, the Austrian government suspended the office entirely. The Statthalter, imperial governor, ruled instead. The message was clear: the time of mediators was over. Power would no longer flow through ancient rituals but direct command. A ceremonial resurgence. Despite its formal suspension, the idea of the Palatine refused to die. In 1867, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise created the dual monarchy, restoring Hungary's internal autonomy. Yet even now, the Palatine did not return as a political figure. Instead, the title became honorary. In 1867, the king appointed Archduke Joseph Karl, grandson of the elder Palatine Joseph, to the role. He carried the title until 1905 but had no functional duties. Still, he appeared at public events. He signed university charters. He stood beside royal processions. His presence stirred a quiet pride, a connection to a time when Hungarian governance involved more than imperial decrees. But the days of scrolls, seals, and dusty provincial courtrooms were long gone. Final years and formal dissolution. The last Palatine was Archduke Joseph August, appointed in 1912. Though he served symbolically, the political tides had shifted irrevocably. World War I shattered the Austro-Hungarian state. The 1918 Astor Revolution and subsequent Soviet Republic abolished the office entirely. The Horthy regime, 1920–1944, revived the title briefly in name only, but it held no influence. In 1946, the Second Hungarian Republic formally abolished the monarchy and all noble titles. The office of the Palatine never reinstated after the war faded into legal and historical memory. After nearly 1,000 years, the position that had once held court over river disputes, inheritance claims, and royal policies was no more. Bureaucratic immortality. Even in death, the Palatine lives on in language, in law, and in memory. The term Nador remains embedded in Hungarian historical consciousness. Streets, schools, and squares still bear the name of Joseph Palatine. His reputation for moderation, infrastructure building, and linguistic sympathy endures. And more subtly, the institutional habits that the Palatine embodied remain alive. The balancing of royal power with legal tradition. The use of mediation instead of edict. The slow, deliberate rhythm of constitutional reform through discussion and compromise. Today's Hungarian parliament, like many modern legislatures, still carries the DNA of these principles. Reflections on the office. The office of the Palatine is a reminder that quiet power is often the most durable. While kings died in battle and rebels rose in fire, the Palatine sat in modest courtrooms, listening to disputes over fences and fish ponds. He resolved centuries of tension not with charisma, but with procedure. His power was rarely glamorous. Often it was painfully dull, but it was sustainable, and it earned him a rare kind of respect, not awe, not fear, but trust. That trust kept the kingdom functioning through invasions, dynastic collapse, and foreign occupation. Final reflection, the weight of silence. As we close this second story in our long journey through the bureaucracy of ancient Hungary, one question lingers. In a world where the loudest voices often prevail, what does it mean that one of Hungary's most enduring institutions was built on patience, paperwork, and whispered negotiations? Was the Palatine the embodiment of something we've lost, a belief that power can be both accountable and restrained, not through force, but through form? Or was he simply a figure of his time, destined to be swept away by the speed of the modern world? Either way, for nearly a millennium, he sat in the hallway beside the throne listening, weighing, recording. And for that, history remembers him. Story 3, Section 1. The Dirt Beneath the Crown, How Medieval Hungary Counted Its Fields. A land of fields, a kingdom of numbers. You are standing in a freshly plowed field outside a Hungarian village in the year 1261. A clerk has just dismounted from his horse. His boots sink slightly into the spring mud. He carries no sword, no badge of office, only a bundle of scrolls, a wax tablet, and a measuring rope. He is here for one reason: to count the land. In this section, we explore the slow, laborious, and astonishingly detailed process by which medieval Hungary turned its soil into statistics, how land was counted, categorized, and taxed under the Arpad and post-Arpad administrations. It wasn't exciting, it wasn't glorious, but it was how the kingdom paid for its wars, built its monasteries, and financed the bureaucracy we've already come to know. The true engine of Hungarian medieval power was not the royal court, not the crown, and not even the army. It was the unchanging, uneven rhythm of agrarian taxation. Why count the land? In an agrarian society, wealth is not stored in banks, vaults, or marketplaces. It is embedded in the land itself. The more land one controls, the more grain one harvests, the more animals one pastures, the more people one can feed or tax. But land is not self-evident. You cannot tax a vague notion of acreage. It must be defined, measured, and recorded. For Hungary, especially during the 11th, 14th centuries, land taxation evolved slowly. It was driven by royal need, ecclesiastical ambition, and noble rivalry. The state required predictability, and for that it required numbers. Tax rolls, field surveys, registries of serfs, and rent obligations, these became the quiet weapons of administrative power. The first surveys, not quite a census. Early Hungarian kings like Stephen I and Ladislaus I implemented crude land surveys, mostly to ensure tithes, church taxes, were paid. These surveys didn't measure the land in meters or hectares, but in productivity, units, a much more telling figure. A field wasn't measured by length or breadth, but by how much grain it could produce. One Jabajitelek, peasant plot, was often defined as the amount of land one peasant family could farm. Plowland was measured by how many oxen, and how many days it would take to till. Pasture land might be recorded by how many pigs or sheep it could support over the winter. These early records were rudimentary, sometimes just oral testimonies written down by a bishop's clerk, but they served a purpose. They anchored tax expectations to observable reality. Enter the royal tax inspectors. By the 13th century, especially under King Bela IV, 1235–1270, the royal chancery began dispatching specialized inspectors known as taxadores, officials tasked with determining the taxable value of estates. Their method was simple, repetitive, and maddeningly slow. Arrival and notice. The village received word of the tax inspection. All landowners had to present charters proving ownership. Measurement. Ropes, packing, and the occasional wooden rod were used to approximate field size. Crop recording. Villagers stated what crops had been grown the previous season: barley, rye, oats, or fallow. Livestock count. All households reported or hid their animals. Obligations cross-check. Inspectors verified if peasants were fulfilling their robot labor obligations, tithe and rent. Document entry. All data was recorded onto wax tablets or scrolls, to be copied later into a central registry. The most common unit used, the porta or gate. This was not a measurement of land, but of tax capacity, how many peasant households a landowner had, each with a gate wide enough to allow a cart. The porta tax. The porta system, first fully codified in the 14th century, became the cornerstone of Hungarian taxation. One porta equals one tax-paying peasant household, roughly 2–3 adult workers. Tax per porta varied, but typically a fixed amount of silver or grain. Nobles paid no tax on their own land, but were taxed per peasant household residing there. This system had two significant features. It encouraged the state to care about accurate headcounts of dependent peasants. It gave landowners incentive to underreport peasant households or conceal them. Tax inspectors knew this. They often made surprise visits, relied on village gossip, and occasionally punished communities by blanket taxation if underreporting was suspected. In essence, the tax rolls became an unending chess game between the crown's desire to raise money and the nobility's desire to avoid paying it. Bureaucratic battles in the dirt. The soil itself became a battleground for paperwork. Villages frequently disputed which estate owned which section of land, especially if boundary markers, trees, rocks, fences had decayed or been moved. In 1278, for instance, a dispute arose between two Benedictine monasteries over a barley field near the Tisza River. The monks cited conflicting royal charters. A royal tax inspector was called in to examine the field's size, condition, and tax history. The process took 6 months. The verdict: the field had been counted twice. One charter used the spring survey, another used an autumn crop yield. The inspector declared the land under dual claim, and its tax burden was split accordingly. This boring, equitable ruling prevented a holy war. The role of the village notary. As land surveys became more routine, many villages appointed their own notarius, a literate villager, often a minor cleric or retired scribe who kept local records of ownership, yields, births, and tax payments. These notaries translated royal demands into practical actions, recorded complaints and appeals, held copies of past charters and field layouts, negotiated with visiting inspectors. In a way, the village notary became the face of the bureaucracy, not because he ruled but because he remembered. If a field had yielded oats in 1249, or if a family had paid their tithe during the bad harvest of 1257, it was likely the notary who knew and could prove it. Maps before cartography. While Hungary lacked detailed land maps until the early modern period, early surveyors made diagrammatic field sketches, often annotated with Latin notes and markers like oak tree boundary or burned mill site. These sketches were crude, but they were records. Some of these pre-cartographic diagrams survive in monastic archives, offering fascinating glimpses into how land, memory, and administration were tied together. The map didn't need to be beautiful, it needed to be persuasive. Soil as social order. Behind the counting of fields was a deeper truth. The soil was more than property. It was a social order. Knowing who owned what, who farmed where, and who paid whom kept rural Hungary from descending into constant feudal anarchy. Disputes over 3 feet of barley land might seem minor, but they often hinted at larger issues. Rival noble claims, overlapping charters, or ancient obligations reasserted. The tax surveyors didn't just count fields, they stabilized expectations. And in a pre-modern state, that was everything. The limits of numbers. On paper, the tax rolls of medieval Hungary appeared to offer certainty. They recorded how many gates a village had, how many plow oxen a family used, and what crops were sown in spring. But as anyone working with parchment and peasants soon learned, numbers often lied or at least concealed. This section explores the challenges and subtleties behind the kingdom's efforts to count and tax its land and people. Far from a clean ledger of income, Hungary's agrarian tax system became a mirror of its contradictions. Nobles hiding wealth, peasants fleeing fields, entire communities existing outside official view. This was not corruption per se. It was the natural tension between bureaucracy and reality. As Hungary tried to turn a living countryside into fixed revenue, it found itself counting things that moved, changed, and at times vanished. The peasant flight. In years of hardship, famine, war, or plague, peasants fled their obligations. A village listed as having 24 porta taxable households might find itself half empty after a bad harvest or after an armed noble feud passed through. These people didn't disappear entirely. They often moved into wooded areas, squatted on lesser-known land, or attached themselves informally to a noble who promised better treatment or lower rents. This presented a problem: who owned them, who taxed them. Royal officials complained that entire counties, especially along the kingdom's less settled eastern frontiers, held ghost villages, appearing on maps but devoid of inhabitants, or alternatively full of people not on any rolls. In response, kings issued decrees forbidding peasants from relocating without written permission, but these were nearly impossible to enforce in remote areas. And so the chancery began categorizing mobility. Advina, recent arrival, usually untaxed for a year. Deserterius, someone who fled a prior lord, possibly subject to fines. Colonus absconditus, a hidden tenant often discovered during surprise inspections. To find them, officials sometimes relied on rival landlords' accusations. One noble might report another for harboring fugitive peasants not out of justice, but spite. The noble tactic: one gate, many peasants. The most common method by which nobles avoided tax was to underreport their peasant households. Since the porta system taxed per gate, the trick was to build fewer, official gates, even while allowing multiple families to live on the land. Imagine this: a manor houses 10 peasant families but only constructs 3 wide entryways through which all carts and livestock move. When inspectors arrive, they find 3 porta, the rest invisible. Some noble estates even relocated gates, closing old ones and opening new ones strategically just before inspections. Villagers were warned to keep quiet or face punishment. Royal officials were not blind to this, but proving it required intrusive inspections. And because noble estates were often defended by private guards, inspectors tread carefully. The royal chancery responded by updating the definition of a porta. Instead of physical gates, it now referred to peasant households with a plow team and a pair of oxen. but nobles simply began pooling oxen between households. Thus the game continued. Villages in dispute. Another challenge was unclear ownership. Two nobles might claim the same village, each producing a charter from different reigns. Until the matter was settled, sometimes years later, the peasants might be taxed twice, or not at all. This created perverse incentives. Nobles encouraged confusion over old boundaries. Peasants played landlords against each other, seeking the one with lower obligations. The chancery created commissions to resolve ownership, but these too were subject to bribery or delay. One famous dispute from 1326 between the Gutgold and Cisak families over 5 villages in Slavonia took 11 years to resolve. In the interim, no taxes were collected, and the peasants developed their own local system of self-governance. By the time the case was closed, the royal treasury had lost a decade's worth of revenue, but the peasants had gained a taste of independence. The gateless peasantry, cotters, shepherds, and the landless. The porta system assumed a neat agrarian society. Each family had a field, some animals, and paid predictable dues. But Hungary's countryside also held cotters, zelerek, landless laborers who lived on the edge of villages, shepherds and swineherds, who moved with flocks and often crossed estate boundaries, craftsmen and millers, technically peasants but without fields. These people often lived outside the tax system or were included only as supplements to another's porta. A noble might list 12 full porta and 7 attached dependents. These invisible taxpayers produced wealth, but rarely paid taxes in their own name. Later reforms attempted to account for them, adding fractional porta categories, but the records remained patchy. And yet these people made up a significant portion of the kingdom's labor. Without them, grain was not milled, flocks were not tended, and forests were not cleared. Hungary's taxation system never fully solved the problem of how to count the uncountable. Forest law and hidden wealth. Forests were vital resources offering timber, game, mushrooms, and charcoal, but they were difficult to tax. Who owned them? Who used them? The crown often claimed rights over royal forests, but nobles and monasteries increasingly enclosed them as part of their estates. Peasants, meanwhile, continued to use them informally. A tax inspector might find dozens of charcoal burners and pig herders living deep in forest territory, none recorded, none taxed. The response: the crown created forest courts, usually chaired by a regional espan or palatine representative, which determined usage rights. But enforcement was hard. Trees didn't carry seals, and peasants were experts at temporary structures, a hut built and gone within a season. In the 14th century, one inspector lamented, "We chase shadows in the leaves." The role of the church. Monasteries and bishoprics often owned entire villages. While they were exempt from royal taxes, they still collected rents and dues from their peasants. In effect, they maintained parallel tax registries. Sometimes these clerical records were more accurate than the crown. The monks of Pannonhalma, for example, kept detailed records of sowing and harvest yields per field, tithe payments down to the sheaf, livestock tallies by season. But these records were jealously guarded. Royal officials rarely gained access, and clerical holdings were politically protected. Still, royal inspectors would sometimes consult abbots unofficially when they suspected local nobles of underreporting. This created a quiet network of bureaucratic whispers between crown and church. The tension of truth. Ultimately, Hungary's tax bureaucracy existed in a permanent state of approximation. It was never entirely accurate, nor was it meant to be. Rather, it produced sufficient truth, enough regularity to sustain the state without triggering rebellion. Everyone, peasants, nobles, scribes, and kings, knew the numbers weren't perfect, but they agreed to treat them as real. And in that collective fiction, Hungary found equilibrium. Inspectors made peace with missing names. Clerks allowed old estimates to stand. Tax collectors accepted partial payment, not out of laziness but practicality. It was a system based not on precision, but on negotiated tolerances. The shape of a nation, drawn in furrows. As the scribes dipped their quills and the tax inspectors rode from village to village, Hungary's landscape was slowly being organized not in roads or walls, but in ledgers. Each hilltop, meadow, and brook began to acquire meaning not only in folklore or property rights, but in fiscal obligation. In this final section of Story 3, we explore how the kingdom's agricultural bureaucracy influenced Hungary's broader identity politically, socially, and even philosophically. Beyond mere taxation, the act of measuring land and assigning it value helped shape noble privilege, peasant obligation, royal policy, and national consciousness. And while the system was imperfect, approximate, and full of petty evasions, it gave the kingdom its daily rhythm, a cycle of seed, harvest, record, and rule. The agrarian foundation of noble power. Hungarian nobility was not defined primarily by lineage or military heroism, but by land ownership. The greater one's estate, the more peasants one could host, and the more porta one could shelter and conceal. But with land came obligations legal, fiscal, and ceremonial. The act of being counted, or not, in the tax system became a form of status. High-ranking nobles often negotiated tax exemptions, not because they were poor, but because the exemption itself confirmed their power. Lesser nobles, especially in outer counties, might volunteer to have their holdings assessed, seeking visibility and recognition in crown records. One could even argue that the difference between a free noble and a rich peasant lay not in wealth, but in who knocked at their door with a wax tablet. To be listed in the royal registries as landholder, witness, or exempt person was to exist within the legal framework of power, and the agrarian records, while dry, became the gatekeepers of that recognition. Revenue and the crown's limitations. Despite the growing sophistication of tax surveys, the crown still struggled to convert agricultural potential into reliable income. Why? Exemptions. Nobles, church holdings, and royal domains often escaped direct taxation. Inaccuracy. Port accounts were easily manipulated, and inspectors were limited in number. Collection. Even when taxes were due, collection depended on regional officials, many of whom owed loyalty to local magnates. The result, monarchy on a budget. Hungarian kings, unlike their French or English counterparts, lacked consistent access to cash. This limited military campaigns, curtailed foreign ventures, and made kings dependent on diet approval for extraordinary levies. And so, paradoxically, the more the kingdom tried to count, the more it exposed the limits of royal reach. The records were detailed, but power remained fragmented. The counting mentality. Over time, the practice of listing, recording, and tabulating land began to shape how people thought about their place in the world. For peasants, land became a ledger line. They might not know Latin, but they understood that their plow width, livestock number, or gate location could influence their tax. For nobles, charters were treasured as physical tokens of identity. More than weapons or estates, the scroll with the seal proved their right to exist as elite. And for the royal court, budgets, levies, and foreign diplomacy began to rely on grain yield projections and estimated port accounts. Ambassadors might negotiate military aid by quoting how many oxen the king could feed per year. It was the emergence of what scholars later called the fiscal imagination, the idea that a kingdom could be measured, calculated, and perhaps even improved by accounting. The 15th century reformers. By the early 1400s, there were growing calls to revise Hungary's tax system. Reformer administrators like János Vitéz, an archbishop and political strategist, pushed for more accurate census taking, rotation of tax assessors, and standardized forms. One key innovation: dual verification, where two different officials, one appointed by the king, one by the local nobility, had to agree on port accounts before taxes were finalized. Another was the cadastral plan, early efforts to sketch consistent land boundaries, field by field. These were precursors to modern mapping, though still crude. Results were mixed. Resistance remained strong, especially from wealthier nobles. But the effort signaled a growing awareness that Hungary's strength depended not just on how much land it had, but on how well it knew that land. The price of order. Yet for all its benefits, the bureaucracy of agrarian accounting came at a cost. It reinforced social divisions, favored landowners, and often reduced people to figures: plowmen, oxen teams, gates. Peasants became units of production, tallied in annual reports. Forest communities were treated as illegal trespassers. Widows and the elderly, whose productivity was lower, were often taxed unfairly. The system's cold neutrality, its emphasis on repeatable categories, erased local nuance. A community recovering from fire might be taxed like one enjoying abundance. Unless they had the means, or literacy, to protest, the paper would not protect them. And so, while the crown's registers grew thicker, the empathy of governance sometimes grew thinner. Taxation and resilience. But it would be unfair to present this system only as exploitative. There were moments of adaptability, flexibility, even mercy. During years of plague or crop failure, tax rates were sometimes suspended. The Chancery issued blanket pardons to counties devastated by military raids. A well-argued petition, accompanied by a charter and supported by a local priest, could reduce or erase a peasant family's arrears. In this, the bureaucracy revealed another quality: resilience. It could bend without breaking. It made room for variance, for human error, and even for compassion, though never too loudly. That flexibility was perhaps its greatest strength. A rigid system would have cracked. This one, like the fields it counted, bent with the seasons. The great chain of paper. By the time of Matthias Corvinus's reign in the late 15th century, Hungary had developed an unusually rich administrative infrastructure for an East Central European kingdom. His famous Black Army was partially funded by an enhanced tax system that relied on updated port accounts and professional inspectors. And yet, even he, one of Hungary's strongest monarchs, still relied on the humble scribes, the scrolls, and the soil. His reforms built on existing structures rather than replacing them. His court secretaries, many of peasant origin themselves, continued to file counts of goats and oats alongside declarations of war. The machinery of state may have gained polish, but its gears still turned on agriculture, obligation, and arithmetic. The legacy of measurement. Though modern Hungary bears little resemblance to its medieval past, remnants of the porta system persisted into the 19th century. Land surveys, estate boundaries, and legal disputes over property often cited documents written in the 1200s and 1300s. Villages today still carry the footprints of those early registries: fields divided according to ancient estimates, forests bearing the names of old tax records. But perhaps more importantly, the mentality of measurement, that one can govern not only with charisma or creed, but with consistency, remains part of the national legacy. Even today, a Hungarian villager filing property papers might find themselves referencing cadastral maps drawn from lines etched in wax 5 centuries ago. Final reflection: what is a kingdom without its counters? If a king rides with banners, a bishop blesses the crown, and the noble guards his manor, then who ensures the rows of barley are counted, the gates are noted, and the people are remembered? It is the clerk, the notary, the inspector, the ones who walk through mud with ropes and tablets. They were not exalted, they were not loved, but they built the country's continuity. So perhaps the question is not how much Hungary taxed, but how much it understood itself through counting. Can any nation endure without knowing what it owns, who tills its soil, and how many gates open each spring? Story 4, Section 1, The Tripartitum and the Long Shadow of Bureaucracy. A book too boring to burn. Imagine, if you will, a book so dry, so densely written, and so legalistic that most people who referenced it never actually read it in full. Yet this book, compiled in the early 16th century, governed the Kingdom of Hungary for centuries. It was quoted in lawsuits, invoked by nobles, memorized by clerics, and loathed by reformers. It shaped rights, land ownership, taxation, and justice. And its author, a career bureaucrat with a gift for structure and an obsession with noble privilege. This is the story of the Tripartitum, a legal codex compiled by István Bureaucracy, and arguably the most powerful unread book in Hungarian history. In this first section, we'll examine how the Tripartitum came to be, not through revolution or royal decree, but through the slow accretion of centuries of precedent, cases, and customary law. It is not a tale of dramatic change, but of tedious consolidation. And that, as it turns out, is what gave it its staying power. The context: a kingdom without a unified code. By the early 1500s, Hungary was already showing signs of institutional fatigue. The Ottoman Empire loomed in the south. Royal power had eroded, and the nobility, increasingly fragmented and fiercely independent, filled the vacuum. The legal system was a patchwork. Royal charters, decrees from long-dead monarchs, customary law often unwritten, and church mandates all coexisted badly. Local judges applied law inconsistently. Nobles quoted ancient privileges. Peasants appealed to oral traditions. And the royal chancery, increasingly overburdened, struggled to keep pace. What Hungary lacked was a unified statement of law, something that codified not new principles, but existing practice. Enter Bureaucracy. Who was István Bureaucracy? Born around 1458 into a modest noble family, István Bureaucracy, also written Bureaucracy, rose through legal and political circles as a man of principle and precision. Educated in Vienna and Italy, he returned to Hungary with a deep admiration for Roman law, but also a strong belief in Hungary's unique legal customs. Bureaucracy served as a judge, legal scholar, and diplomat. He was appointed as Protonotarius Regius, chief notary of the realm, which gave him unprecedented access to court cases, charters, and statutes. And what he saw horrified him, not because it was unjust, but because it was messy. So he began writing. The purpose of the Tripartitum. Between 1504 and 1514, Bureaucracy worked on what would become the Tripartitum Opus Juris Consuetudinare Incliti Regni Hungarii, the three-part work on the customary law of the illustrious Kingdom of Hungary. It wasn't meant to be revolutionary. In fact, Bureaucracy explicitly rejected foreign legal systems. He sought to preserve Hungarian custom, but in written form, organized for use. The Tripartitum was divided into 3 books. Book 1, The Origin of the Hungarian State, the Role of Kingship, and the Privileges of the Nobility. Book 2, Procedural Law, Lawsuits, Property Rights, Inheritance, Duels, and Court Behavior. Book 3, Specifics of Criminal Law, Sanctions, and Obligations between Peasants and Landlords. Despite being based on customary law, the structure was modern: numbered paragraphs, logical flow, and precise definitions. It was both scholarly and deeply conservative. Noble privilege systematized. One of the Tripartitum's main goals was to protect noble rights, especially those of the true noble landowners. According to the text, all nobles were legally equal, regardless of wealth. Nobles could not be taxed without the Diet's approval. Nobles could not be arrested without a legal verdict. Noble land was immune from seizure, except through legal ruling. To Bureaucracy, These weren't privileges, they were the foundation of Hungarian liberty. Peasants, by contrast, were legal subjects. Their duties were outlined, their mobility restricted, and their rights, such as they were defined largely in negative terms, what they could not do without permission. But Bureaucracy wasn't cruel. He believed in order. He argued that a well-defined hierarchy protected all. Chaos, not inequality, was the true danger. Custom over decree. What made the tripartitum unusual wasn't just its content, it was its source of authority. Bureaucracy didn't argue from royal power, or divine law, or even canon law. He appealed to custom. This was subtle but revolutionary. In an age when monarchs were pushing for centralized authority, Bureaucracy was saying, the king cannot create law alone, he must preserve the nation's traditions. This gave the nobility a powerful ideological tool. By quoting the tripartitum, they could block royal innovations. By referring to ancestral custom, they could resist taxation, legal reform, or land redistribution. The tripartitum effectively became a constitutional defense of the noble order, disguised as a dry reference book. Not officially a law, but used like one. The most curious fact about the tripartitum: it was never formally enacted as law. King Louis II reviewed the manuscript in 1514, but died 2 years later at Mohawks. Later kings found its content too noble-centric to endorse officially. And yet, the tripartitum was printed, copied, taught, and cited in courts for centuries. It became de facto law through repetition, not legislation. Its very existence created a legal culture in which custom had more weight than command. Law professors taught it, legal clerks quoted it, peasants feared it, nobles wielded it. The book that was never fully ratified became the pillar of Hungarian jurisprudence. 1514, the peasant revolt and the tripartitum's final touch. In a twist of timing, Bureaucracy completed his manuscript just as Hungary was rocked by the Dazsa Rebellion, a massive peasant uprising fueled by unpaid labor, famine, and broken promises of crusade. The nobility responded with harsh repression. Bureaucracy, ever the legalist, added provisions in the final tripartitum draft that clarified peasant obligations, confirmed their immobility, and reinforced landlord rights. To many historians, this moment crystallized the book's function, not as a neutral reference, but as a conservative instrument meant to freeze society in place. And yet, Bureaucracy still saw it as fair. The law was clearest, he believed, when each class understood its place and when power flowed through predictable channels. Custom bound in parchment. When István Bureaucracy first penned the tripartitum, he likely never imagined it would survive not just decades, but centuries, reprinted, rephrased, and revered. Though never passed into official statute, it lived where it mattered, in courtrooms, county archives, and the minds of jurists. It offered Hungary something rare in the medieval and early modern world: a shared language of law, written not by royal decree, but by custom, structured and defined. In this second section, we trace the life of the tripartitum after its creation, how it was read or not, how it was applied, how it constrained reform, and how it quietly became a national identity document, all without the drama of battle or revolution. It did not conquer, it simply endured. Reprints, repetition, and the authority of format. The tripartitum was first printed in Vienna in 1517, just 3 years after its completion. Its timing coincided with the printing revolution, which allowed the work to spread rapidly beyond chancelleries and noble courts. Subsequent editions followed in 1565 Basel, 1584 Kassa, 1616 Nagyszombat, 1669 Pozsony, and throughout the 18th century, with increasingly annotated commentaries. The work was often bound with other reference texts or printed in large legal compendiums. Law students, Jurists and noble sons alike would have encountered it as a standard part of their education, not because it was inspiring, but because it was necessary. Its format, numbered sections, consistent citations, and organized logic made it remarkably easy to use in real disputes. A 17th-century county judge could settle an inheritance claim by pointing directly to Section 13 of Book II. No need to summon royal precedent. No need to create new rulings. It had already been said. And once cited enough times, a thing begins to feel inevitable. County courts, the book in action. Most legal cases in Hungary were not settled in royal courts or urban tribunals, but in county courts, where noble judges handled a constant flow of property disputes, contracts, and petty crimes. These courts were slow, meticulous, and deeply loyal to custom. Here the tripartitum was king. A nobleman contesting a land boundary. The tripartitum outlined procedures for bringing witnesses. A tenant accused of abandoning his land without permission. The tripartitum defined when departure was illegal. Two sons fighting over inheritance from a childless uncle. The tripartitum laid out the pecking order of heirs. Judges often cited it directly in their verdicts. Clerks copied paragraphs into local ledgers. Some counties even created glossed versions, with extra notes written in the margins commenting on how local custom diverged, or didn't, from Bureaucracy's national template. Even when cases went beyond its scope, the tripartitum remained the first question. What does the book say? The common noble, a legal identity. One of Bureaucracy's most impactful concepts was the idea that all nobles were legally equal. Whether a land baron or a penniless noble of the coat, each shared the same rights: exemption from tax, trial by peers, and inviolable property. This principle had political consequences. It gave rise to the common noble identity, a class that may not have been rich, but carried legal dignity. Their weapon wasn't the sword, but the tripartitum itself. In county assemblies, the Mediajules, these nobles would quote passages verbatim. They would protest royal taxes, resist foreign judges, and demand rights under the law of our fathers. The tripartitum was their shield, a book they might never finish reading, but which gave them confidence. Even the Habsburg monarchy, after taking control of Hungary in the 16th century, found it difficult to ignore. When introducing reforms or new taxes, they often included disclaimers. This shall not infringe upon the ancient customs outlined in the tripartitum. The book had become the constitution that was. The peasant's dilemma. For peasants, the tripartitum was not so kind. It defined them as legally subordinate. They had few protections, were tied to the land, and owed dues in labor, goods, and money. But its consistency gave peasants a strange kind of predictability. A landlord couldn't easily invent new obligations, not if the book said otherwise. And some peasants, especially in literate parishes, learned to reference it. In the 17th century, there are recorded cases of peasant communities citing the tripartitum in petitions to their landlords or to the county court. One such document read, "We have served our lord these 3 generations according to the custom. Now he demands more. But as Book 3, Title X declares, a serf owes no more than 3 days' work per week." Their argument was ignored but not laughed at. Even for the lowest in the social order, the tripartitum provided a script, a language of protest that felt legitimate even if rarely successful. The Church and the book. Interestingly, the Church had an ambivalent relationship with the tripartitum. On one hand, it protected ecclesiastical property and upheld tithe obligations. On the other, Bureaucracy's emphasis on custom over canon law subtly challenged clerical supremacy. He respected the Church, but viewed it through the lens of Hungarian sovereignty. Bishops who tried to invoke papal bulls in legal cases were often countered by lawyers holding up the tripartitum and saying, "Yes, but our custom says otherwise." In this way, the book also became a tool of national legal independence. Hungary was Catholic, but its law was Hungarian, not Roman, not Austrian. Habsburg rule and the shadow of the book. After the Battle of Mohacs, 1526, and the rise of Habsburg rule, Hungary became part of a broader imperial framework. Vienna sought to centralize administration, standardize law, and reduce the chaos of competing local customs. And yet the tripartitum persisted. Imperial officials, particularly German-speaking judges sent from the court, often found themselves frustrated. Hungarian nobles refused to accept imperial rulings unless they aligned with Bureaucracy's work. County assemblies cited it as superior to newly printed edicts. Attempts to introduce more modern codes were met with suspicion. Is this in the tripartitum? Was a common question and often a pretext to stall. In 1723, the Hungarian Diet declared that no new law could contradict the principles of the tripartitum unless the Diet itself approved. This was legal conservatism at its finest, not by emotion, but by document. The tripartitum in education. By the 18th century, law students in Hungary were still reading Bureaucracy, often with boredom, but with respect. The text was taught in legal academies and became a rite of passage. Several key traits defined its teaching. Memorization. Students recited passages aloud, particularly those involving noble rights. Commentaries. Professors added notes to explain how practices had changed or hadn't. Mock trials. Students argued imaginary cases using tripartitum citations. Even reformers like Ferenc Deák in the 19th century began their careers with a working knowledge of Bureaucracy's chapters. They might reject the book's principles, but they could not ignore them. To be a Hungarian jurist was to know the tripartitum, even as one planned its undoing. The ghost in the law book. By the 19th century, Hungary had changed dramatically. Railroads cut through farmland. Political liberalism was spreading. Revolutions shook Vienna and Budapest alike. Yet one figure lingered in the legal imagination like a silent notary in the corner of every courtroom: István Bureaucracy. His tripartitum, compiled in the early 1500s, was still being quoted, still being taught, still referenced in property claims, inheritance disputes, and peasant petitions, not because it reflected modern values, but because it had become something greater and duller than ideology. It had become infrastructure. In this final section, we trace the stubborn afterlife of the tripartitum, its clash with reform, its symbolic uses, its quiet role in preserving aristocratic order, and its eventual unraveling in the 20th century. Through it all, the book remained unchanged while the world around it finally moved on. Reformers and reactionaries, the 19th century legal battle. Hungarian liberals of the early 1800s, including figures like Ferenc Deák and István Széchenyi, recognized that the tripartitum was outdated. They criticized its rigid defense of noble privileges, its limitations on peasant mobility, its lack of civil rights and modern definitions of property. And yet, even these reformers used the tripartitum as a benchmark. Rather than discarding it outright, they sought to revise it. In 1832-36, during the Diet sessions in Poznań, Bratislava, reformers proposed a new civil code that would modernize Hungary's legal framework, yet they consistently argued that their changes were in the spirit of Bureaucracy. This contradiction reveals something crucial. Even opponents of the tripartitum understood that its format, its tone, its cultural weight gave their proposals legitimacy. No other text had such binding psychological and procedural force. The 1848 Revolution. The book is broken, sort of. The Hungarian Revolution of 1848, which briefly established an independent Hungarian government, finally broke the legal hegemony of the tripartitum. The April laws abolished feudal privileges, declared equal civil rights, and began drafting a new, more modern legal system. For a brief moment, it seemed the old book had been shelved for good. But after the revolution was crushed by Habsburg forces, legal restorationists brought the tripartitum back not because it fit the times, but because it represented stability. The monarchy, fearful of liberal uprisings, leaned on old legal structures to reassert order. The tripartitum's role shifted once again, not as an active source of law, but as a reactionary symbol. The dual monarchy and the codification movement. After the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, Hungary regained internal autonomy. A new legal codification effort began, but the tripartitum remained a background presence. Why? Because property rights, especially noble land ownership, still referred back to precedents grounded in the tripartitum's language. Even the Civil Code of 1875 had to account for customary land law that originated with Bureaucracy. Lawyers continued to cite tripartitum passages in rural court cases. Judges and legislators might not agree with it, but it was too entrenched to ignore. And so it continued not as law, but as legal culture. The Book and the Peasants. Perhaps the most bitter legacy of the tripartitum was its role in rural injustice. Well into the 20th century, thousands of peasants in Hungary and Transylvania lacked legal clarity over land ownership. When courts examined these cases, they often found that noble families claimed rights based on ancient charters and Bureaucracy's definitions of legal title. One historian referred to it as the dead hand of Bureaucracy, the way an ancient codex could still deny a man the land his family had worked for generations. Even as education spread and peasants gained political voice, the legal structure around land remained frozen. It was not until land reform laws in the 1920s and 1940s, following war, revolution, and regime change, that the tripartitum finally lost its practical teeth. But by then, the social structure it had preserved for 400 years was already collapsing. The communist era, an odd afterlife. Following World War II and the rise of communist power in Hungary, the tripartitum was formally removed from legal education, courtrooms, and state libraries. It was denounced as a relic of feudalism, a charter of oppression. And yet, legal historians in Budapest and Debrecen quietly preserved annotated copies. Graduate students translated and analyzed it as part of legal archaeology. Marxist critiques of pre-modern Hungary often referenced Bureaucracy not to praise him, but to show how systemic inequality had been encoded in law. Strangely, this criticism kept the book visible. While communist Hungary moved forward with a radically different vision of justice, land, and class, the tripartitum remained in the background not as guide, but as ghost. Post-communist legacy, a cultural relic. After 1989, with the collapse of socialism, Hungary faced a new question. What parts of its pre-modern legacy should be embraced, and which should be left behind? The tripartitum re-entered the national conversation now as a symbol of continuity and legal tradition, not policy. Modern historians viewed it with fascination. Law faculties included its chapters in legal history syllabi. Tourists visiting national archives were shown copies of its earliest editions, encased in glass, with seals still attached. In rural Hungary and Transylvania, land disputes from the 1990s still reference deeds grounded in Bureaucracy's terminology. And today, scholars continue to debate its role. Was it a force of national cohesion? A cage of inequality? A brilliant synthesis of custom? Or a failure of adaptation? The answer is yes to all. The structure that outlived its purpose. The tripartitum did something rare. It gave a name, shape, and internal logic to a nation's legal self-image, and it did so without drama. No divine revelations, No parliamentary vote, just careful compilation, clear writing, and bureaucratic obsession. Its survival was not due to charisma or violence. It endured because people used it, quoted it, relied on it, even when it hurt them, even when they didn't fully understand it. The ultimate power of the tripartitum was not what it said, but what it replaced: confusion, inconsistency, and the chaos of unspoken rules. It made Hungary noble to itself in paragraphs, titles, and ink. Final reflection: what makes a law endure? In a world where regimes fall, constitutions change, and ideologies burn out, the tripartitum offers a humbler lesson. Sometimes, the most enduring laws are those we believe already exist, waiting to be written down. So is a kingdom made by the sword, the crown, the people? Or is it made by the quiet hand of a jurist, summarizing what everyone already assumed and calling it law? Story 5, Section 1: Salt Roads and Toll Gates, Logistics of Monarchy Revenue. The invisible arteries of a kingdom. You find yourself following a mule cart, laden with thick white blocks wrapped in straw, creaking slowly across a dirt road winding through the Carpathians. There are no banners, no soldiers, no drums, just a quiet convoy guarded by tax collectors and toll clerks. And yet this unassuming column is more important to the stability of the medieval kingdom of Hungary than any knight or court ceremony. This is not a treasure caravan. It is a salt transport, and it carries the kingdom's lifeblood. In this section, we begin the story of how medieval Hungary funded its monarchy not through gold mines or expansive trade empires, but through logistics, the controlled movement of salt, the establishment of toll points, the management of roads and ferries, and the ever-present hand of royal revenue agents. It was a world defined by dirt roads, paper ledgers, and seasonal floods, a world where geography shaped government. This is not the story of kings. This is the story of infrastructure. Why salt? In an age before refrigeration, salt was essential. It preserved meat through harsh winters, it flavored food, and it held ceremonial and religious value. It was so vital that it was considered a white gold, a staple of economic policy and taxation across Europe. Hungary, especially Transylvania, was blessed with significant salt mines, including Székelyek, Párizd, Torditörde. These mines, under direct royal control, became fiscal engines. The salt extracted was not simply sold, it was regulated, moved, and monetized under a system that turned physical geography into a bureaucratic institution. From mine to market, salt moved under armed watch, through fixed routes, and was recorded at every stage. The salt monopoly. By the 12th century, the Hungarian crown had established a monopoly on salt extraction and distribution. Private mining was forbidden. Merchants could not buy or sell salt independently. Instead, all salt passed through royal depots where it was weighed, priced, taxed, and then distributed. The crown determined how much salt each region could purchase, what price would be charged, varying by distance, which roads salt could legally travel on, who could escort, guard, and store it. The aim was not just revenue, it was control. Salt was treated like a strategic commodity. Even in times of war or famine, the salt depots were guarded and records were maintained. Clerks assigned to these posts often kept multi-language ledgers, since Hungarian, Latin, and sometimes Slavic or Saxon dialects were used by merchants. The salt roads. Transporting salt was not left to chance. The crown designated official salt roads specific routes from mines to major markets and border points. One of the most important routes was the Maros Valley route, which began in Torda and passed westward toward the Tisza River and central Hungary. These routes were maintained at royal expense, with funds often diverted from tolls, patrolled by local ispans or their deputies, lined with designated resting stations, where teams of oxen or mules could be rotated. Each convoy had a fixed number of carts, escorts, and paperwork. Disruptions such as landslides, bridge collapses, or brigand attacks were reported back to the Crown through a network of toll offices. Salt, unlike spices or silk, wasn't carried by elite merchants. It was moved by government logistics, a medieval postal system of minerals, toll stations, and revenue nodes. At strategic points, river crossings, mountain passes, market towns, the Crown established toll gates, vamhiliek. These were simple structures: a wooden gate, a weighing platform, and a clerk with a quill and a locked box. Tolls were not just on salt. Other goods, grain, wine, cloth, livestock, were taxed as well. But salt paid reliably, and toll clerks were instructed to record every passing load. Key features of toll operation: dual oversight, one royal and one local official present to deter fraud. Daily logs, every cart's contents, weight, origin, and destination logged. Monthly summaries sent to the Treasury, often by horseback courier. Penalties: unauthorized bypassing of tolls could result in land seizure or imprisonment. These toll gates formed a network of fiscal observation, not unlike customs checkpoints today. River ferries and floating salt. Many routes used Hungary's extensive river system, particularly the Tisza, Danube, and Drava. Salt was loaded onto barges, which then floated downstream toward depots and cities. At major river crossings, the Crown operated ferries which doubled as toll collection points. Ferrymen were often employed directly by the Crown or local chapters under royal license. River transport was cheaper and faster, but it carried risk. Flooding delayed schedules and damaged goods. Piracy from outlaw bands, especially near borderlands. Corruption, with crews underreporting cargo weights. Still, the rivers were essential. A salt barge from Torda to Szeged could carry 50x more than an ox cart caravan, and with fewer tolls. Case study: the Salt Office of Szeged. Szeged, located at a strategic confluence of the Tisza and several salt routes, housed one of Hungary's busiest salt offices in the 14th century. The office employed a chief clerk, 2 weighmasters, 4 laborers, 1 scribe dedicated solely to copying reports into Latin. Salt arrived by barge or cart. Each load was weighed. A portion of the salt was stored in royal warehouses to be distributed to authorized buyers, often towns under fixed contracts. Each week, the office submitted tallies of salt received, salt distributed, revenue collected, spoilage or loss. This paperwork, dull and repetitive, flowed upstream to the Chamber of the Salt, a division of the royal treasury. It was, in effect, a government within a government with its own staff, rules, budgets, and conflicts. The unseen role of monasteries. Interestingly, monasteries and bishoprics often played a logistical role in the salt system, not as vendors, but as warehouse keepers. Salt needed dry, cool storage, and churches had cellars. In exchange, monasteries received salt allowances used for food preservation, candle making, and trade with nearby villagers. Some abbots kept better records than royal clerks. When a shipment went missing in 1321 near Kalaxa, it was the abbey's logbooks that proved a false toll report. The offending clerk was removed, and the monastery rewarded with additional salt privileges. Thus, religious institutions became fiscal instruments because they were dry, literate, and immovable. The frailty of the system. Despite its structure, the salt and toll system was vulnerable. Bribery: toll clerks took payments to underreport cargo. Violence: nobles sometimes attacked convoys and claimed road rights. Weather: winter freezes or spring floods could halt entire routes. Famine: in lean years, peasants raided salt stores, leading to local unrest. One winter, records show that over 30 carts of salt were lost near the Drava crossing due to a collapsed bridge. No tolls could be collected for 2 months. The treasury absorbed the loss. And yet the system persisted because it had to. When revenue meets reality. In the dusty ledger room of a toll station, two clerks argue over decimal fractions, one with ink on his fingers, the other with coins in his sleeve. Outside, a convoy of carts creaks past, their drivers nodding wearily to the guards. A third clerk quietly adjusts the weight recorded for one of the wagons. This was the daily world of the Hungarian salt and toll bureaucracy, not grand, not glorious, but indispensable. In this section, we delve into how the royal government kept the salt system running, the humans behind the paperwork, and the inevitable corruption and reform attempts that shaped these quiet arteries of power. This is not a story of great reforms. It is a story of constant tension between the ideal system outlined in royal ordinances and the realities of bribes, mistakes, and soggy roads. Bureaucrats in the field, the toll clerks. The backbone of Hungary's salt logistics were its toll clerks, vamirok and weighmasters. Posted at every major checkpoint and depot, they were responsible for recording weight and volume of goods, assessing tolls according to royal tariff tables, collecting payment often in coin, sometimes in kind, logging discrepancies, delays, or missing goods, reporting upstream to regional salt chambers or treasury. A typical toll station had 3-5 staff, including a scribe, a weighmaster, and armed guards. Toll tariffs varied by commodity, cart size, number of oxen, and road conditions. These clerks were literate, often trained in basic Latin, and part of the rising class of non-noble bureaucrats, men whose power came from pen and ink, not swords or bloodline. Paperwork and redundancy. To prevent fraud, Hungary's salt and toll system used dual-entry logs. Each transaction was recorded both at the station and on the driver's accompanying manifest, fuvarlevél. Discrepancies were reconciled at depots. Once a month, toll officers sent sealed packets of toll receipts, cargo manifests, witness statements if disputes occurred, emergency logs whether theft, unrest. These reports flowed to regional salt chambers, which compiled annual revenue reports for the royal treasury in Buda. Yet despite these safeguards, the system was slow and paper-heavy. Reports often arrived late. Clerks reused parchment. Rodents ate corners of ledgers. Still, the machinery of fiscal observation kept moving. Corruption, inevitable and institutionalized. No system of royal tolls in medieval Europe was free from corruption, and Hungary was no exception. Common forms of abuse included underweighing, salt cargoes listed as smaller to reduce tolls, ghost carts, toll receipts issued for goods that never existed, bribe for bypass, allowing privileged nobles to pass untaxed, kickbacks, local toll clerks funneling revenue to regional officials in exchange for protection. Investigations were sporadic. In 1365, a royal inquest at a toll station near Vach found that 2 clerks had embezzled over 300 marks in salt duties over 4 years, nearly a full year's income for the station. The punishment: removal from office, partial repayment, and reassignment, not execution. The crown understood that corruption was better managed than eradicated. Who watched the watchers? To supervise toll stations, the crown relied on inspectors, known as szaflugyelek, salt overseers. They traveled unannounced to stations, reviewed logs, inspected warehouses, and reported directly to the Chamber of Salt. But even they were subject to pressure. Nobles often demanded exemptions. In border regions, local magnates like the Bathory or Rákóczi families used their influence to exempt entire shipments from tolls, citing strategic military importance or ancestral rights. Thus, the ideal of uniform taxation was continually undermined by privilege. The urban connection, salt and city rights. Royal towns, Shabed Kurili Verisok, such as Debrecen, Kassa, and Paix, were granted contracts to receive fixed quantities of salt at negotiated prices. These contracts were politically significant. Towns received favorable prices in exchange for loyalty. Salt quotas were tied to the town's tax obligations. Failure to pay or distribute correctly could result in royal fines. Cities managed their own salt warehouses, with urban clerks handling distribution. In times of shortage, some towns prioritized local elites, leading to riots or royal intervention. In 1423, the city of Brasov, was reprimanded for hoarding salt during a winter famine, leading to peasant unrest in the surrounding villages. Floods, fires, and lost salt. The physical movement of salt was fraught with natural hazards. Flooded roads delayed carts and rotted straw packaging. Fires in wooden depots destroyed entire seasons of stock. Bridge collapses led to losses recorded as acts of God. Bandits and rebels sometimes looted convoys. Each loss had to be documented, often in great detail. One report from 1459 describes how 2 oxen drowned in a river crossing, pulling 8 salt blocks into the current. The local clerk appended an illustration, a tiny drawing of the overturned cart. These moments of loss were not just tragic, they were fiscal events. Missing salt meant missing revenue. Women in the system. While most clerks were men, some widows of toll officers were granted continuation licenses after their husband's death. These women managed smaller toll posts or served as scribes. Records from the 1470s mention Judith, the widow of Clerk Loring, maintaining the toll books at a station near Neerbader. Her logs, preserved in fragments, were praised for their clarity and neatness. She even filed a complaint against a local squire who attempted to pass 3 unlisted salt carts, an act that led to a small skirmish and brief royal attention. Such moments show that the salt system, for all its rigidity, had human edges. Reform attempts. Several monarchs tried to reform the toll and salt system. Charles I, R. 1308-1342, issued uniform tariff tables to reduce local variance. Sigismund, R. 1387-1437, attempted to centralize toll revenue in a new royal chamber. Matthias Corvinus, R. 1450-1490, introduced performance-based rewards for toll officials. Each reform made small improvements but failed to break noble exemptions or fully audit the system. The biggest barrier to reform was consistency. As long as the crown received predictable revenue, it tolerated a certain level of inefficiency. After all, the bureaucracy was not designed for justice, it was designed for function. The language of salt. Documents from this period offer a glimpse into the specialized language of this system. Savam salt duty. Fuvarleveil cart manifest. Meromster Waymester. Atsazasi and Jadali, permit to transfer salt across jurisdictions. Elvesitatal, lost item or shipment. Scribes developed shorthand notations and stamps, some of which became standardized marks across the kingdom. A particularly ornate wax seal from 1441, belonging to the salt depot at Vared, Oradea, featured a carved block of salt with the Latin motto, Duris est fidelis, hard but faithful. The beginning of the end. By the late 16th century, the great arteries of Hungary's salt and toll system had begun to clog, not from lack of salt, but from the pressures of a changing world. Military campaigns drained royal coffers. Roads deteriorated. The power of the landed nobility overwhelmed bureaucratic procedures. And then came foreign rule, new economic ideologies, and eventually trains. In this final section, we follow the slow unraveling of the once robust salt and toll system, how it was reshaped by war, eroded by decentralization, and finally replaced by modern fiscal models. Yet even as it faded, echoes of the old toll gates and salt depots continued to shape local economies and administrative habits. The empire may have grown, but the toll clerk's ledger never quite disappeared. The Ottoman disruption. After the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Hungary was effectively split into three: Royal Hungary in the west, Ottoman-controlled Central Hungary, and the semi-independent Principality of Transylvania. This fragmentation wreaked havoc on the centralized salt monopoly. Ottoman regions no longer sent revenue to Buda. Salt depots fell into disuse or were taken over by new local rulers. Toll roads were militarized or abandoned. Salt convoys became targets not of petty bandits, but of military patrols and shifting borders. One account from 1543 describes a royal salt convoy near Szolnok being seized by Ottoman-aligned raiders, the salt redistributed, and the wagons burned. The toll clerks were executed. The system that once turned salt into gold now turned it into a liability. Transylvania, a microcosm of salt survival. In Transylvania, nominally independent, but influenced by the Ottomans, the salt system persisted in a strange hybrid form. The Transylvanian princes, such as Gabor Bethlin, maintained a state-run salt monopoly to fund their small bureaucracy and army. They reopened mines, restored depots, and kept toll logs, but often allowed noble exemptions in exchange for political loyalty. Salt was no longer a symbol of uniform control. It had become a localized bargaining tool. Clerks kept their ledgers, but instead of mailing them to Buda, they delivered them to Kalas Var or Julef Hayavar under regional seal. The system still functioned, but it no longer connected the kingdom. Habsburg bureaucracy, centralization and its limits. Following the full incorporation of Hungary into the Habsburg monarchy, starting in the late 17th century, Vienna brought with it a new idea: centralized, rational, imperial finance. Habsburg rulers such as Maria Theresa and Joseph II launched reforms to modernize salt taxation, redrew toll boundaries, standardized rates across regions, introduced new accounting formats, converted some tolls into monetary taxes collected annually. They also imposed German-speaking administrators on many local offices, which led to tensions with Hungarian clerks. These newcomers viewed the old toll system as quaint, inefficient, and susceptible to graft. Yet the local economy was still built on these procedures. Reform efforts often had to accommodate the toll gates and depots rather than remove them outright. Vienna could legislate, but the man weighing salt at Kexkamate still used Werboxy's definitions and wrote his ledgers in Latin. Toll farming and privatization. Facing increasing costs and administrative strain, the monarchy in the 18th century began leasing toll rights to private individuals and corporations toll farming. Toll farmers paid a fixed sum to the state for the right to collect revenue on a route or at a depot. Whatever they collected beyond that was profit. This model reduced state expenses, encouraged efficiency in theory, deepened inequality and abuse. Toll farmers squeezed peasants and merchants with aggressive enforcement. Complaints soared. Petitions were sent to the crown. Some toll farmers became notorious figures like Ferenc Kadar of Miskolc, known for weighing carts with a generous thumb. But the crown tolerated it because revenue was predictable. The rise of railroads and the irrelevance of roads. In the 19th century, the advent of railroads reshaped the landscape. Salt was now moved faster, cheaper, and in bulk. Road toll stations lost relevance as cargo shifted to rail. Depots were moved or consolidated near railway hubs. By the 1860s, many toll gates were shuttered. The classic wooden arms, once painted and sealed with royal wax, were dismantled. Yet some towns resisted. Local leaders argued that tolls supported road maintenance and guards. In Szalnok, a former salt toll was repurposed into a bridge tax, renamed and expanded. Infrastructure had evolved, but the idea of extracting value from transit remained. Modern bureaucracy takes over. With the establishment of the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy in 1867, Hungary regained autonomy and launched a series of internal reforms. Abolished most internal tolls, merged salt administration with the general tax ministry, professionalized fiscal officers, now civil servants, not royal appointees, switched entirely to currency-based taxation over commodity levies. By 1890, the last dedicated salt toll post was closed. The salt system, which had once stretched across valleys and villages, was now just a line item in the finance ministry's annual report. Clerks no longer tracked sacks, they tracked numbers on forms. Cultural echoes and local memory. Despite its disappearance, the salt and toll system left deep traces in Hungary's cultural landscape. Many villages still bear names like Saskat, Salt Well, or Vamzék, Toll Seat. Folk songs reference the toll clerk's ink, or the salt road to the west. Ruins of depots and toll houses survive, some converted into museums or inns. In old family ledgers, private households listed salt money among expenses into the 20th century. Even modern Hungarian idioms contain echoes. Szóval fizetni, to pay in salt, meaning to pay honestly. Turbot niam a Latban, literally weighs more on the scale, an idiom born of the weighmaster's craft. What remained? Though the toll gates vanished, the broader habits of precise accounting, layered bureaucracy, and geographic-based taxation endured. Hungary's modern tax system still reflects regional differentiation, formalized clerical roots, and deep institutional memory built not on philosophy, but on salt carts and toll books. Some scholars argue that the medieval salt system was Hungary's first true national administrative network, predating postal services and unifying disparate provinces under shared rules and weights. It may have been slow, flawed, and prone to fraud, but it worked for centuries. Final reflection. In a world of conquests, coronations, and courtly intrigue, it is easy to forget that kingdoms are held together not just by kings, but by roots, records, and revenue. Hungary's salt and toll system reminds us that even empires rest on the shoulders of men counting sacks, stamping manifests, and opening gates at dawn. The final ledger entry of the last salt toll office reads simply, "No more carts, no more guards, warehouse empty, locks returned." Can a civilization truly change if its methods of control remain hidden beneath the skin, quiet, procedural, and utterly boring? Story 6, Section 1. The Village Assembly, Forgotten Democracy in the Hungarian Countryside. Introduction, where power sat beneath a linden tree. Imagine a village in medieval Hungary. There are no castles here, no noble banners or marble courts, only fields, timber houses, and the low murmur of wind through trees. But once a week, something remarkable happens. A group of villagers, men of age, landholders, elders, gather beneath the linden tree in the center of the village. They do not kneel or bow. They sit in a circle. They discuss. They vote. Welcome to the village assembly, or falidulays, a local tradition of collective self-governance that persisted for centuries across rural Hungary. While the nobility debated at court and kings issued decrees, peasants ran the day-to-day logistics of village life through consensus and participation. In this section, we explore how these assemblies functioned, who participated, what they could decide, and why, despite their obscurity in modern memory, they represent one of the earliest forms of grassroots democracy in Europe. Let us begin where all authority once sat, beneath the tree. The roots of rural autonomy. Rural self-governance in Hungary developed in part because of necessity. Royal power could not effectively reach every village, and noble landlords often delegated routine decisions to the villagers themselves, as long as taxes were paid and order was maintained. By the 13th century, village assemblies had become standard practice in most Hungarian-speaking areas, especially in regions with freer peasantry, such as Transdanubia, Upper Hungary, modern-day Slovakia, Transylvania, particularly among Shakely and Saxon communities. These assemblies function like a local council, with the power to distribute common lands and resources, assign labor duties, especially for building roads, cleaning ditches, etc., resolve disputes between villagers, manage local fines and compensation, elect village officials such as the Bureau, village judge. The decisions were binding and recorded sometimes on parchment, sometimes orally, often in wooden tally sticks or notched boards. This was not democracy in the modern, egalitarian sense, but it was participatory governance, rule through presence and precedent. The physical setting, the seat of the people. In many villages, the assembly met in a designated location commonly called a nape Julesi Heli, the people's gathering place. This might be under a linden, oak, or elm tree, symbols of justice and continuity. Near the village well, where all paths crossed. In some places, near the boundary stone, especially when border disputes were discussed. These meetings were open air and announced in advance by bell or crier. All full male heads of household were expected to attend. Absence without cause could incur a fine or even land reassignment. In certain regions, particularly among Shakely communities, women could attend and speak in advisory roles, especially in widowhood or in matriarchal households. Villagers often stood or sat on logs or rocks arranged in a rough circle. No one stood higher than another. Decisions were made by voice vote or consensus clapping, a tradition where unanimous approval was marked by a rhythmic striking of hands. The role of the Bureau. The Bureau, pronounced Biro, was not a judge in the modern sense. He was more like a headman, elected annually or biannually by the village assembly. His duties included presiding over the assembly meetings, enforcing decisions made by the group, collecting taxes and delivering them to the noble landlord or tax officer, representing the village in dealings with external officials. While the Bureau held symbolic authority, he could be removed or reprimanded by the assembly. In some areas, re-election was prohibited more than once in a row to prevent entrenchment. To maintain impartiality, Bureau candidates could not be direct kin to the previous Bureau, a rule often enforced in small villages with strict genealogical memory. Law without lawyers. Disputes over livestock, land boundaries, unpaid debts, or marriage arrangements were settled by the assembly. Legal traditions were customary, not codified, and varied from village to village. Judgments might include compensation in goods, e.g., 3 hens for a broken fence, forced public apology under the village tree, temporary loss of grazing rights, community labor as penance. There were no professional lawyers, and appeals to higher courts were rare, partly because of the cost, but also because the village was self-contained. This system emphasized reconciliation, not punishment. It worked best in stable, land-based communities where everyone knew everyone else. Oral records and memory as institution. Many assemblies had no written records, especially in the earlier medieval period. Instead, decisions were memorized by designated elders, who acted as living minutes of past meetings. In Transylvanian Saxon villages, however, written protocols, protocolum, were introduced by the 15th century, often in Latin or German. These records included decisions made by the assembly, attendance rolls, notation of fines, taxes, and disputes. In Shakely villages, Wooden tally boards were used. Each board had notches indicating the number of days of communal labor owed by each family. These were stored in the church attic or community granary. Even illiterate communities had sophisticated methods of institutional memory. Limits and exemptions. Village assemblies were powerful but not absolute. They could not override royal edicts, refuse taxation set by the king or landlord, impose criminal punishment beyond local restitution, challenge noble privilege on external matters. In times of war, plague, or famine, assemblies were often suspended or replaced by emergency councils appointed by the landlord. In certain large estates, especially near mining towns, the landlord retained more control, and assemblies were allowed only to manage grazing or water rights, not full village affairs. Still, in most of rural Hungary, the norm was autonomy. The assembly and the seasons. Village life followed the rhythms of nature, and so did governance. Spring, assemblies convened to assign plowing and irrigation labor. Summer, resolutions on hay meadows, grazing schedules. Autumn, disputes over harvest borders, tax allocation. Winter, time for indoor dispute hearings and debt settlements. In many communities, Epiphany, January 6th, or St. George's Day, April 24th, were traditional meeting days. The assembly was not an abstract institution. It was woven into the agricultural calendar. Suppression and survival. The rise of Habsburg centralization and later modern state structures brought increasing restrictions on village assemblies. 18th century, royal decrees limited their authority in legal matters. 19th century, bureaucratic reforms subordinated assemblies to county officials. Post-1848, revolutionary changes reduced peasant autonomy in favor of formal courts and standardized administration. Yet in practice, assemblies continued to function into the 20th century, especially in isolated or mountainous regions. Anthropologists in the 1930s documented village meetings in parts of the Matra and Shakelefeld that mirrored their medieval counterparts almost exactly. And in a few cases, local governments in post-WWI Hungary referred to ancient assembly rights in legal disputes over land. A living democracy forgotten. Today, few Hungarians recall the tradition of the Fallodules. The concept of democracy is usually tied to revolutions or parliaments, not to groups of farmers sitting under a tree. But perhaps that is the point. Before democracy became a doctrine, it was a practice. Before votes were cast in ballot boxes, they were spoken aloud to neighbors. Before legal codes, there was memory. The village assembly was slow, conservative, often unfair by modern standards, but it was also responsive, participatory, and remarkably durable. Unresolved reflection. In an age where we associate power with cities, screens, and institutions, what does it mean to remember a time when power sat on a wooden stump, beside a well, under a tree? Can democracy survive without memory of the places where it first took root, not in capitals, but in villages? Institutional memory and the politics of the familiar. In a Hungarian village circa 1500, when a new biro was elected or a land dispute resolved, the result wasn't just a bureaucratic formality, it was part of a deeply embedded social rhythm. The village assembly functioned not just as a form of governance, but as a ritual of belonging. Every decision affirmed the community's right to self-determination, however limited. Every vote recalled the previous one. Assemblies were governed as much by memory as by consensus, and that memory was carried not in books, but in the minds and traditions of the people who sat, year after year, under the same tree. In this section, we follow the evolution of the assembly across centuries, how it adapted to political pressures, preserved local customs, and gradually collided with state centralization. We also trace how it survived in folklore and how echoes of its governance lingered in village behavior, long after the assemblies themselves were suppressed. Let us step deeper into the mechanics of this forgotten system of rural democracy. The yearly cycle of governance. Most villages held 3 or 4 formal assemblies per year, often aligned with the agricultural calendar or religious feasts. Some communities used fixed days, such as St. George's Day, April 24, start of the agricultural season; Pentecost, May-June, determination of summer grazing and water usage; Michaelmas, September 29, post-harvest tax assessment; Epiphany, January 6, debt settlements, new leadership elections. Meetings could be called extraordinarily in response to sudden issues: wolf attacks, land disputes, or flood damage. The biro or the village crier, Kikialto, would walk through the settlement ringing a bell or calling out the gathering's time and location. This cyclical pattern gave villagers a predictable framework for civic participation, intertwined with the work and hardships of agrarian life. Rules, customs, and precedents. Each village followed a hybrid of customary law, shakasjog, and royally issued decrees. Customary law governed matters like field rotation and planting order, dowries and inheritance within the village, grazing boundaries between households, permissions for marriages, especially into or out of the village. These customs were passed down by word of mouth, embedded in ritual phrases spoken at assemblies. For example, a harmadic harangues utan ninks kifagaz, after the third bell, no objections. A kinemyurt as edgiazit, who did not come agreed. In many regions, these sayings carried legal force. Elders served as oral witnesses to prior decisions, often quoting past resolutions verbatim. In this way, law was recitation as much as judgment. This memory-centered governance meant that stability mattered more than innovation. Dealing with disputes. Village assemblies did not handle major crimes like murder or treason; those were the domain of royal courts. But they regularly arbitrated personal and economic disputes, especially those rooted in the shared use of land and labor. For example, if 2 households claimed a single grazing path, the assembly might walk the boundary together, then vote. If a debt was unpaid, the assembly could impose public labor penalties or community shamming, such as requiring the debtor to serve drinks at the next festival. If a villager consistently neglected communal duties, e.g., ditch clearing or road repair, the assembly could reassign his land parcel to another family. Punishments focused on reintegration, not alienation. Public apologies, symbolic restitution, and restitution through community service were preferred over physical punishment. Only in extreme cases such as chronic theft or refusal to pay taxes would a villager be reported to higher authorities or banished. The power of exclusion and inclusion. The right to participate in the assembly was tied to one's status in the community. Typically, full voting rights were granted to male heads of household, landholding or tenant; certain widows, particularly in matrilineal households or among the sheikhly; trusted craftsmen or non-landholders, occasionally granted voice by honorary consensus. Newcomers to the village, especially non-Magyar settlers, often had to wait a full year before gaining voting rights. During that year, they were expected to contribute labor and abide by customs without the right to speak or vote. The assembly thus operated as a gatekeeper, deciding not only how to govern, but also who belonged. Assemblies under pressure, landlords and lords. Despite their autonomy, village assemblies existed under the shadow of noble and royal authority. Each village was part of an estate, and the landlord Ferldesir had the right to demand taxes in kind, coin, or labor, overturn assembly decisions that conflicted with their interests, install or reject biro candidates, particularly under repressive regimes. However, most landlords preferred to delegate authority as long as dues were collected. Assemblies offered a form of cheap administration, one the landlord didn't have to directly manage. Conflicts arose, however, when villagers resisted increased tax demands, disputed land grants or forest access given to noble allies, refused to send conscripts for military service. In these cases, landlords could call in county authorities, levy collective fines, or impose martial oversight. Such interventions were feared, but they were relatively rare until the modern state began expanding. Religious influence and ecclesiastical participation. In many villages, the local priest played a subtle but influential role in assemblies. He often opened sessions with a prayer. He might mediate disputes, particularly marital or moral ones. In times of crisis, plague, poor harvest, his word carried extra weight. However, the priest was not always aligned with the villagers. Especially under Catholic Counter-Reformation, assemblies in Protestant villages viewed state-aligned priests with suspicion. In contrast, in Transylvanian Unitarian and Reformed communities, the pastor was often deeply integrated into local governance and could even be elected as a community recorder or council member. Resistance and rebellion. Village assemblies were also a seedbed for resistance, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. In the early 1700s, during Rákóczi's War of Independence, many villages refused to pay taxes or deliver food to imperial troops. Assemblies declared collective disobedience, with records noting phrases like "Mi nem vagyunk a Caesar szolgai, hanem a magunk urai." We are not the emperor's servants but our own masters. Punishments for such acts included public whippings of the biro, dissolution of the assembly, or military occupation. Yet these moments cemented the political consciousness of rural communities. Even in submission, villagers remembered that they had once governed themselves. Folklore in afterlives. Though formal assemblies were largely dismantled by the 19th century, their memory endured in folk songs referencing Biro the judge's election, oral stories about disputes settled under the wise linden, local sayings such as Ni shaljbale nem veji biro, don't speak up, you're not the judge. Some post-feudal village councils in the 20th century mimicked the structure of assemblies, holding meetings in circles, avoiding hierarchy, using unanimous voice votes. Even under communist collectivization, certain villages preserved the assembly spirit by conducting informal decisions about resource sharing through elders and seasonal meetings. Historical neglect and modern interest. Until recently, historians largely overlooked village assemblies. Seen as primitive or anecdotal, they received little attention compared to royal charters or noble parliaments. But a growing body of research drawing on archival parish records, ethnographic surveys, and linguistic analysis is now recognizing these assemblies as crucial instruments of social cohesion, proto-democratic structures rooted in local legitimacy, sources of alternative political traditions. In a way, Hungary's village assemblies represent a parallel political history, one not written in blood or marble, but in seasonal labor, disputes over hay, and the long memory of who owed whom a chicken. Twilight of the linden tree. By the late 19th century, the Hungarian countryside had begun to change, slowly at first, then all at once. Railroads crisscrossed old cart paths. Young men left the land for factories. The centralized state expanded its reach into taxation, justice, and education. In this shifting world, the ancient institution of the Falajulays, the village assembly, didn't vanish in dramatic fashion. It simply faded. This final section traces how the institution unraveled not with a revolution, but with administrative replacement. It explores how memory preserved the habit of collective governance even after its formal end, and how echoes of the village assembly spirit endured in everything from 20th century council meetings to local resistance against central rule. We will end where all stories of local democracy must, with a question of whether its disappearance was progress or something lost. The state takes over. The 1848 Hungarian Revolution briefly revived hopes of peasant autonomy. Revolutionary leaders promised land reform, peasant enfranchisement, and local control. Yet the failed war for independence, followed by the Austrian reoccupation, led to intense centralization. Key consequences for village governance. Traditional assemblies were subordinated to newly formed municipal councils, Kursági Tanácsok. Village officials were now appointed or confirmed by county or state administrators. Customary law was replaced by the Hungarian Civil Code, written in Budapest. Decisions on land use, schooling, and taxation were transferred to district offices. By the 1870s, village assemblies had no official legal standing. The linden trees remained, but the ritual had no authority. Bureaucratization and its tools. The new municipal order brought paperwork, stamps, and hierarchies. Ledgers replaced oral records. Forms required multiple authorizations. Local clerks were trained in standardized state procedure. This shift seemed logical, even progressive. Uniformity promised fairness. Centralization was seen as modern, but for the villagers, it often meant distance decisions were now made by men from elsewhere, speaking in the language of officials, not neighbors. The biro became a symbolic figure, often with no real power. He received visiting tax officers and relayed messages from the district, not from the assembly beneath the tree. Memories in resistance, the village mindset. Though the assembly was dismantled formally, its social memory remained powerful. Villages continued to gather informally to make decisions about grazing and shared fields, festivities and public works, interpersonal disputes. These informal assemblies lacked legal force, but in the eyes of locals, they were legitimate. In the early 20th century, ethnographers found villages in Szabolcs and Nógrád counties that continued to meet in traditional ways, sitting in circles on feast days, using consensus-based decision-making, inviting the oldest members to testify on past decisions. Even where the law had moved on, the cultural mechanism of governance had not. Echoes in the communist era. Ironically, the communist regime, despite its centralized and authoritarian nature, revived certain elements of village assembly structure during the 1950s-1970s, albeit under strict control. Local councils were created, and though they were state-run, they held public meetings, julets, encouraged communal labor decisions, consulted elders, especially in agricultural cooperatives. These meetings were far from democratic. They often reinforced party control, yet villagers adapted them to their needs. One oral account from 1968 in Borsod-Zemplén County describes how a public council to assign grain quotas quietly transformed into a traditional-style assembly, with disputes aired and collective decisions made outside the official agenda. The impulse toward gathering, speaking, and deciding together, understood as legitimate when done in the open, among peers, persisted. Symbolism in the landscape. Even today, the landscape of rural Hungary bears quiet signs of the assembly tradition. Trees in village centers, particularly linden and elm, are often preserved as heritage landmarks. Some towns maintain a Régi Gyülési Hili sign, marking the former location of the assembly. Cultural festivals in Transylvania and northern Hungary sometimes include symbolic assemblies, reenactments with historical costumes, and staged decision-making. More subtly, Local organizations such as agricultural cooperatives, forest user groups, and irrigation associations still operate through seasonal, consensus-based meetings that resemble the structure of the old assemblies. The form is secularized, bureaucratized, but the rhythm remains. Reassessment in modern historiography. Recent decades have seen a resurgence of academic interest in the village assembly tradition. Historians now recognize it as a grassroots model of participatory governance, predating liberal democracy. Ethnographers emphasize its role in conflict resolution and social cohesion. Legal scholars study it as an early form of customary jurisdiction. Crucially, these assessments emphasize that the assemblies were not primitive. They were adaptive, resilient, and responsive to local needs. Modern governance theorists have even drawn parallels between Hungarian assemblies and other decentralized democratic practices, such as the Swiss Landsgemeinde, Scandinavian Thing traditions, early New England town meetings. Hungary's Falajulays belongs in this lineage, but remains less celebrated. The assembly as a cultural archive. Beyond governance, the assembly preserved cultural knowledge. Local dialects were spoken and passed down. Land boundaries and ownership were recorded and defended through collective memory. Oral histories were retold, often during disputes. Communal values, honor, fairness, reciprocity were reaffirmed through shared decision-making. In this way, the assembly served as a living archive, constantly updated not with ink but with voice and consensus. And when external powers from Habsburgs to Soviets tried to overwrite this archive, villagers often maintained two systems, one official, one remembered. Lessons for the present. In a time when democracy is often associated with elections, laws, and institutions, the village assembly reminds us of something quieter. That participation can be habitual, not ideological. That governance can be localized and relational, not just representative. That legitimacy is often found not in law, but in shared memory and visibility. This is not to romanticize the past. The assemblies excluded many voices: women, the landless, minorities. Custom often trumped fairness, but it is to suggest that community-based governance offered something modern systems struggle to replicate: trust born of familiarity. Closing reflection. So the linden tree stands empty now. The logs are gone. The circle is broken. But the idea that governance might be done not through institutions imposed from above, but through dialogue rooted in place is not so distant. And perhaps, as modern democracies wrestle with disconnection and decline, there is something worth remembering in the image of neighbors gathering beneath a tree, to speak, to listen, to decide. If democracy fails to feel local, can it ever feel real?